This happened a long time ago now, and comes from a brief yet highly disturbing encounter. Despite it being brief, it would eventually leave a long-lasting impression on me, and will likely remain the most messed up thing that I've ever experienced. My story began when I was a 14-year-old boy. To give some context, I was one of those part of the group but not one of the group types, shy and sort of reserved. I had friends but not much beyond school hours. So when one of my friends wanted me to hang out with her, it made a welcome change to my quiet after-school routine of video games. We walked back to hers from school, and she invited me into her house. As I walked in, I saw whom I quickly assumed was her dad, with his back to me preparing food. This was the first time I'd been introduced to him, and my first impression would quickly be, putting it very mildly, not great at all. As my friend introduced me, he turned around to face me holding a large kitchen knife. Suddenly, he lurched towards me as if he stumbled forward, yelling, "Whoa!" He quickly turned the knife, pushing the handle quite hard into my chest. He then smirked with the eeriest expression on his face and said, only joking. My heart was pounding, and inwardly I was freaking out, and while I tried to nervously laugh it off, I'm sure my face clearly said otherwise. My friend just laughed it off as Dad fooling around and led me to their living room, but as I sat down, I couldn't shake the uneasy gut feeling I had now. I tried to shake it off and talk to my friend, but her dad promptly entered the living room. They had music playing moderately loud on a stereo, and he cranked the volume to a level that sounded like a live band was in there with us. My friend followed him to the kitchen and soon returned. She told me that she had to go to the store to get something for him and asked if I wanted to wait for her as it wasn't too far. Given the rather creepy encounter, my gut instinct was having none of it and I wouldn't be ignoring it. So I quickly got up and I left with my friend for the store. I cannot say exactly how the rest of the day went, as I really cannot remember, but I do know that I didn't return to that house again. I wouldn't speak of what happened after that for quite some time and just chalked it up to a really freaky interaction, locking it away in my mind. However, it wouldn't end there. He would set foot into our house a year later, dropping my friend off at a family party that we were having. I didn't interact with him then, though my dad offered him a beer and later recalled how he just stood there in a corner alone, watching everyone. I would see my friend's dad for the third time, a couple of years later, this time on TV, as the face of the man convicted for the abduction and murder of a woman who went missing a week prior. I was stood there, right as the story broke of who he was. I will never, for as long as I live, forget the sensation of my blood turning to ice in my veins. My parents later commented how they literally saw the color drain on my face in that moment. Yet in the days that followed, it only got worse. He would go on to confess while in custody to the abduction and murder of a woman who had been missing for 20 years by that point. Following corroborations of things that he had said previously, along with expert analysis, this led the police to believe that he may have actually been a prolific serial killer. He was soon probed as a potential suspect in almost half a dozen unsolved missing person cases. However, due to a lack of evidence and further confession, his involvement in these remain, unclear. My mind still occasionally wanders to that first encounter, and even though his choice of victims seemed to be women, I can't help but think about that music cranked up so loud, how my friend asked me if I wanted to wait for her at the house with him. If I had stayed, what would have happened to me, if anything at all? Was there a part of him that was curious, wondering about switching things up a little? Or was that knife held to my chest truly just the harmless joke of a serial killer? Myself and my new girlfriend, now wife, met our freshman year in college. We've now been together 11 years and started dating in 2013. Well, both of us still to this day refuse to talk about this, but I feel someone here may be able to explain it. During our sophomore year in New York, my great aunt from North Carolina passed away just before summer. So that summer, we planned to both go down to North Carolina and stay in the house to clean it up and prepare to sell to save my grandmother the hassle. Things were relatively normal for the first month. Nothing stuck out, with the exception of my Australian shepherd would refuse to walk into the living room unless it was to go outside. He, now 15 years old, always stayed in the master bedroom or the kitchen. I even got a pinch collar to convince him to walk around the 10-acre property, but as soon as he knew that we were going into the living room, he would start yelling and barking, the hair on his back would stand up, and he would just go dead weight on me. A little bit of background to help set the scene too. I'm Ukrainian-American, with my mother's side being from North Carolina. My wife is half Hispanic and half white from Southern California. My wife, then girlfriend, is a devout Catholic. No ouija boards, no tarot cards, even Harry Potter wasn't allowed in her house growing up. I'm not religious at all, really. I was raised Roman Catholic by my dad's side and Pentecostal on my mum's, but drifted away from it all in my early high school years. My great-aunt's house looked like a Pentecostal museum when we moved in. Year-round nativity sets, angels, crosses on every mantle, a Bible on every end table, you name it. The house was built in 1901, and before my aunt owned it, my great-grandparents lived there. Imagine old brown 3-foot wide by 10-foot long wood siding, tin roof, brown shag carpet, and even some traditional pine hardwood floors in the rest of the house. Anyway, about a month into cleaning and clearing the house, we started getting woken up by my Australian shepherd growling every night for hours on end. This, over about a week, escalated to pots falling out of cabinets randomly several times a day. I'm an extreme skeptic and swore the house was so old, especially the windows, that a draft must be causing this. At this point, we were about halfway done clearing the house, and the tension and the paranoia was really starting to get the best of us. We started getting extremely angry at one another, and started accusing one another of trying to scare the other. It got to the point where I would stay up to watch her sleep as long as I could. And then it happened. We were both in bed around 2 a.m. when my dog shrieked like he was being beaten. We both shot up to see my dog on the bed barking at the door to our room into pitch-black darkness. I told my wife to stay with him, and I got up to take a look around. Everything was normal. The doors were locked, windows shut. Nothing abnormal except for one thing. All the 6 little porcelain nativity scenes in the living room and the 4 in the kitchen had all been turned to where every individual character was facing our bedroom door. The one thing that was worse, however, was baby Jesus was missing from every set. I absolutely lost it, accusing my wife of trying to freak me out, which caused her to freak out, and the whole time that we're fighting, my dog is silent, staring into the living room from the bedroom. So I had a bright idea. I just knew my wife was messing with me, so I borrowed 2 trail cameras from my hunting cousin and had a tape recorder from my classes. Without telling my wife the following day, I planted the tape recorder somewhere that she couldn't see and put a trail camera outside facing the front door and one in the living room behind the recliner facing our bedroom door. Nothing happened for a few days, and we were set to leave on the upcoming Friday to move into our new apartment back in New York. And this was the worst week of my life that I'll never forget in a million years. Monday night, I wake up at 2 a.m. again to find my dog crying under our bed, no other activity. Tuesday night, I wake up from my wife having a terrible nightmare. I wake her up to calm her down and realize that my dog isn't in the room with us. I get up, turn on the lights, and it's freezing cold in the house. Summer in Sampson County, North Carolina is pretty hot though, so that really... We found my dog sitting in the living room staring into the fireplace. He wasn't growling or crying, he was just still. I tried to get him to come back to bed, but he just wouldn't budge. I went to grab his leash and take him for a walk. I assumed that he had to go potty. and for the first time ever, he snapped at me. I've trained this dog since he was 8 weeks old, and he's never bitten or snapped on me ever before or even after this. After about 3 attempts of him biting me, I left him in the living room and tried to get back to sleep. I woke up at 5 a.m. to him sitting on the bed, snarling at me. We stared at each other for what felt like hours before he finally laid down and started to cry like the night before. On Wednesday, my wife woke up at about 8 a.m. and I was still wide awake from the terrible night before. As I explained to her what had happened, she got up to make us a coffee, 4 steps into the kitchen, and she lets out the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I bounce up instantly, run over, and there's a 6-foot black chicken snake trying to climb the wall. I grew up around them, so I grabbed it by the neck and chucked it into the backyard. Side note, we don't like to kill them down here. They eat mice and other pests, so they're good. My wife, though, was done at this point and started packing her bags to head to New York a few days before I planned to leave. She left at 9 p.m. that Wednesday night for New York City. Wednesday night, I wake up at around 1 or 1:30 in the morning to what sounded like a crashing sound. I flip on the light, and the first thing that I notice is my dog is still asleep despite the noise. Again, I walk around the house and see nothing. I begin to walk back to the bedroom, and then that was when I see it. The rocking chair in the living room was rocking by itself. Thursday night, I wake up at around 3 a.m. to what I assume was a bobcat screaming outside my bedroom window. Google bobcat screams. It's terrifying, but I've heard them growing up in Sampson County, so yeah, it shook me, but what bothered me more was my dog was still asleep despite 4 or 5 very loud screams. My aunt wasn't some old lady who was frail and defenseless. I knew that there was a double-barreled 12-gauge in the closet, so I picked it up and checked if it was loaded. It was. Walked out the front door, and I fired a single shot into the ground to scare off the bobcat. But within seconds, the screams intensified and sounded like they were coming from all directions of the blackness. So, as shook as I was, I walked backwards back into the house, grabbed a handful of shells, and convinced my dog to at least wake up, and sat on the bed with him all night. The screams continued from about 3:30 in the morning up until 6:30. Friday morning, I'm done, shaken to my core, terrified, distressed, the whole nine, so I pack my bags, collect my dog, and I drive an hour to my grandma's house in northern Sampson County to get some sleep before I make the trip to New York. I'm telling her about what's boxed up and what's not, and then I begin to tell her about the freaky month that I've had. Her face goes as pale as a ghost. The most religious and serious woman that I've ever known says, "Honey, take a look at this." She hands me a detective magazine from the 1940s, modern-day true crime stories. I come to find out that the woman who owned the house before my great-grandparents was sent away to prison for life. Her crime? Murdering her husband, chopping him up with an axe, and burning all of his body piece by piece in the fireplace. With the exception of one piece of him, his head was recovered under the living room floorboards. I still was extremely skeptical despite all that. But Friday night, I took about a 6-hour nap, collected my things, and I hit the road. I'm passing through Delaware at around 9 p.m., and my phone rings. My cousin's calling, and he says, "Hey man, what's up with all the random pictures of our aunt's house?" I stop at a rest stop, and he sends them to me. They were pretty unremarkable, really. I scanned every photo at least a dozen times and never saw an orb, ghost, demon, nothing. But towards the end of the pictures, though, is where my wife is seen pulling off to head to New York. Then no more pictures of the front house except for me, standing outside with the shotgun and the picture of me leaving. Which means that something in the house was setting off the motion sensor for the camera, behind the recliner, but I couldn't see anything in any of the pictures. Then it dawned on me that I had at least 10 recordings on the tape recorder to go through. I played one after another, listening for ghosts or whispers, but there was nothing. I hear the pans falling, bobcats, my dog, us arguing, but nothing spooky. So I start to listen to them in reverse order, not playing them backward to find subliminal messages or anything like that. But I get to the point where my wife is leaving, and I know that I went outside with her to talk, hug, load her car for about 20 minutes. In the audio, I hear myself talking to her as I walk out the screen door, and then silence. About 5 minutes in, my dog starts growling. Then, for less than 5 seconds, there's a screeching sound and then just dead silence again. I played it over and over and over again, trying to slow it down and speed it up to make out what it was. I tried everything to justify it was the water heater kicking on or the tin roof buckling, but no. I couldn't get it out of my head too. I didn't have a fancy tape recorder, I only had it record lectures. But I finally get back to New York, and the first thing that I do is go down to the audio lab to digitalize the recording. Once I slowed it down about 35%, it was clear as day. The most unhuman, deep, terrifying voice I've ever heard uttered 9 words, 8 of which I could make out, and then silence again. I am here, I am you, then the unknown word that I couldn't make out, and then no God. I played the tape one more time so my wife could hear it. We agreed after that to never talk about it again, and the tape is still buried in some shoebox in our storage locker to this day. I have never set foot on that property again, and believe me, I never will. When I was 4 years old, I had cancer. When I was 5, the Make-A-Wish Foundation built me a cubby house next to our shed. I would go down there nearly every day and play. And one day, however, I noticed what looked like a man standing in the trees behind the shed. Naturally, I stayed away from it. When I had friends over, my friend, who was 2 at the time, would scream and cry about not going near the trees, and everyone made fun of her. Whatever it was, it would never appear when adults were around though, sometimes vanishing when we tried to point it out to our older siblings and parents. One day though, I decided to check out the area on my own without supervision, and I came across the man, except he had 4 arms, a green coat, and a jester's cap on. He had red eyes and pasty skin with red polka dots. He looked at me and sighed a big sigh as if he had found me after looking for me for so long. I noticed he started inching closer, and that was when I decided to run away. I eventually told my grandparents, who thought that I had watched the movie Clowns. My friend then says that she saw a jester under the trees, wearing red and white and having a pin on its chest. Apparently it used to reach out to her and watch her through her window at night. But does this sound familiar to anyone? Has anyone come across something like this? I came across something online called a Caraveldi, whose profile picture and description match nearly identically to this. If you know anything, then please do share your thoughts. So I live in a 40s concrete duplex, and ever since moving in a year ago, things always feel a little tense once the sun goes down, and every now and then things are moved around whenever you leave a room and come back, and occasionally whenever I'm up late working on my computer, I'll see white figures out of the corner of my eye, always in the same spot in the room. I also once had a sleep paralysis encounter where I saw it clearly as it zoomed across the room at me, but I think that I really messed up just now. So my bedroom door faces into a small hallway, and I've always made sure that when coming into my room, I always face my bed and never look away until the door is closed behind me. I don't know why I started doing this or even remember where it started, but it's just like an instinct, I guess. A few minutes ago, though, around 11:40 p.m., I got hungry, so I went to the kitchen to grab something to eat, but when I came back to my room, I don't know why I did it, but as I closed the door, I took a glance behind me into the hallway and saw something that I can only compare to like a mix of SCP-1471 and No Face from Spirited Away, like this white mask-like face, a little taller than me, and I don't think that I saw a body. I'm sharing this on my computer, and I just feel like a kid getting called to the principal's office, and I keep looking away to the spot in my room that the white thing likes to be at, because it keeps feeling like someone is standing next to me, and I keep seeing like a swishing white blur, like someone waving a sheet out of the corner of my eye. Also, just recently I froze in place because I could have sworn that it felt like someone put their hand on my shoulder for a couple of seconds. I don't know what to do about any of this, so I hope that somebody will hear this and will be able to help me. I'm not exactly sure how to start this off, but this is going to be a collection of paranormal experiences that I've had through the 31 years of my life, from early years like 1993 up to about February of 2024. Some of the timelines might be a bit fuzzy, but the events are true. I'll start with childhood and lead up to the present day. So I grew up in a house with both parents and a sister in a fairly new single-story house with absolutely no paranormal history. My sister is just shy of 2 years younger than me. At birth, my sister and I had been baptized and grown up in a Catholic family. Our parents weren't very churchy people, I guess, but our grandparents were the old-school heavy Catholic type. My parents would recall stories to us when we were very little, such as my room was the coldest in the house no matter what. This could be caused from how the ventilation was built for the house, so that wasn't anything too wild. Other things they said were hearing loud bangs on the other side of the house when they're home, pantry doors and silverware drawers being opened when they would come home, and having the washer and dryer start up on their own. They don't remember any of this happening prior to me, the firstborn, being born. As far as I'm aware, they never sold my soul to any demons or anything, because we sure never had much luck or money. But as far as this activity goes, I don't really remember any of this taking place, and I feel like if I did, I wouldn't understand the magnitude of it all anyway. One instance, though, I do recall is being around 7-ish years old and being at a close friend's house. We were sitting on the floor of his bedroom playing Yu-Gi-Oh! He had one of those small Nickelodeon TVs in there, and the remote was on the floor. While we were playing, the remote was going back and forth under his bed and out toward us. We just stared at this in awe. Not realizing this was insane, we just went on about our lives as if nothing happened. Moving into later childhood and teen years, that was when things really picked up. Now, my sister had started to tell my mum and I that she was seeing shadows and felt uncomfortable. My mum also told us that she was seeing shadows and it was intermittent when things would occur. I had personally never seen what they were talking about and was thankful for that. All I recalled during that time was hearing footsteps outside of my room. We had since moved into a trailer due to some tragic life issues, and my mum would tell us that it was some animal under the floor causing the noises. I put full faith into that thought at the time, but looking back, there is just no way. The footsteps as well would be a constant until I moved out. I was in this home from 5 years old till about 22. Growing up, I would always stay the night at friends' houses for Halo LAN parties and try to recreate the food that we saw in epic mealtime. One of my friends had some paranormal things going on over there, and I cannot specifically tie these events to what I dealt with, but I just think it was a wild coincidence. So he had told us that he believed that a little girl was haunting his house, and had dealt with various things like noises and sightings. One specific night, I remember laying on the floor going to bed after another solid gaming sesh, and I could hear this faith carousel music. I put up with it for a few minutes and finally said, "Hey, could you shut off the volume on your DS? We can't sleep." Turns out, he was out cold, and that wasn't him. After I woke him up, we just sat there and stared at each other. He told me that he had toys in the attic and that he thought the little girl was playing with them. So, like most level-headed teenage boys, we decided to ghost hunt. At the time, the show on Sci-Fi, Ghost Hunters with the Taps team, was huge. We had this old-school recording device, and we would walk around the house asking questions, waiting for a response. We finally got the courage to crawl into the attic where the noises had been coming from, and began to have a classic EVP session. It was pitch black outside of the small little flashlight that we brought, and there were about 5 of us seated on the beams asking whatever came to our minds. After some time up there and no responses, that we could hear anyway, we wrapped up and we came down, but left the recorder up there for a period of time that escapes my memory. As we played the tape back, we got to the point where we shut the attic and were all back downstairs, and we actually caught a little girl saying what sounded like mummy, and that was terrifying to us. I mean, we got what we wanted to find, but you don't really think that you would hit on anything. Fast forward a bit towards high school, my mum would ask me if I was moving shampoo bottles in her bathroom. And as a typical teenage jerk, I love doing pranks, but this wasn't me, and my sister isn't that kind of person at all. This would happen maybe once a month or so, it felt like. Along with this, too, we would have lights turn on and off. My mum would find ways to debunk things as to not scare us. The other major incident, though, would be doors opening and closing, but it was only always my bedroom door for some reason. From where my dad sat most nights playing games, well into the early morning hours, he could see my door. He would ask me in the morning if I happened to get up last night, and it was never me opening it. My mum had tried a few times to sage the house and cleanse it of the evil spirits, but this honestly did nothing. In fact, activity never slowed down or picked up, as if she had never tried it at all. In high school, I decided to follow in the family footsteps and start a career in fire or EMS. I took a high school course for EMT and graduated with my EMT cert. I joined a volunteer fire department shortly after graduating to get some experience with the hopes to go career eventually. About 3 years after high school, my nana passed away, and I was very close with her, and this was a sudden death as well. She had always been a big advocate for me, pushing myself and achieving my dreams. I had landed a job at a large ambulance company and was eager to start. I had everything laid out the night before, like the first day of school, ready for my first day. At around 4 a.m. while I was asleep in my room, I remember waking up to my door opening and a short figure standing in the doorway with no discernible features. As I stared at it, I wasn't scared or nervous and felt no malice. The door shut after 15 seconds or so, and I just sort of sat there for a bit, processing everything. This was the first time that I personally saw the shadow figures my family was talking about this whole time. That morning, I told my mum about what had happened, and she said that it wasn't her opening it. She suggested the thought that it could have been my nana checking on me on my first day. She was about 5'2" on a good day, so in my head that sort of added up with what I saw, and so I just went about life. Fast forward a few years, I'm now a firefighter paramedic in a career department, and I've proposed to my high school sweetheart. We just got our own apartment in a neighboring city, and we have our first pup, a wiener dog named Rocky. My fiancé was aware of some of the things that happened to me and my family growing up, but we had no idea that things were going to continue once I moved out. Our lives in this apartment pretty much consisted of me working my rotation of 24 hours on a 48 hours off, which is a pretty standard firefighter schedule, and Erica was going to school to become a dental hygienist. And this apartment is when I began to start connecting some dots that maybe it wasn't just the house that had haunting issues. Small things would happen here, and it was never when my fiancé was home. The apartment was about 900 square feet, so if there was a noise, I would definitely hear it. The things that I would experience here were lights turning on and off, but they wouldn't be in the room that I was in. For instance, the bathroom would turn on and I would be in the kitchen. The toilet would flush on its own, and we had motion sensor rope lights in our small walk-in closet in our bedroom that would turn on in the middle of the night. I remember feeling like someone was with me, but I never felt like it was harmful, just like I was in a crowded room in a sense. I remember hearing female whispers, but would often chalk it up to being in an apartment, even though most of the place would be vacant during the day with my neighbors being at work. During this time, I began to have very traumatic calls at work, the biggest event being one where 2 toddlers were unfortunately killed. This caused my mental health to decline, and there was a strong correlation with this and the activity that seemed to surround me. I began to go through therapy to help with coping through the work issues too. Outside of these small events, nothing drastic happened in the short time that we were at this apartment. We had set our sights on purchasing a home and starting a family. By this time, Erica had graduated and began working in her desired field, and I was as well. We had gone home shopping and found the perfect house for us in a neighboring city that was close to our jobs, family, and friends. Picking up from the apartment, we had moved into the new house and everything was perfect. We had finally made it. 2 kids from the trailer park with successful lives and a beautiful home. Things with work, however, continued to be difficult. I would go on several calls that involved horrible stuff, and working in healthcare during COVID was one of the most miserable and draining things I've ever done. My mental health was at an all-time low, and I was going to therapy on a weekly basis at this point. Through all of this, I never experienced anything at work, even though I spent so much time there. I feel like this was a catalyst for events that followed, though. Once I was at my lowest was when things escalated to new heights. One of the earliest signs something was still going on involved an artsy bathroom sign and a wall-mounted toilet paper holder. You see, my wife had this sign positioned right over this holder, and in theory, a normal household shouldn't have any issues. We heard a loud bang one day, though, and went to that small bathroom and saw the sign on the floor. Thinking this was odd since, no door was closed, no wind was coming through, we put it back up and we shut the door. About 2 minutes later, it fell again and landed directly on the holder. Then it hit me. This thing is still here, and it was still messing with me. This proceeded to happen over and over again in the next several weeks at completely random times, and each time striking the holder. It happened so much that it finally knocked the holder off the wall, and once it was removed, that sign hasn't moved in years since then. Things began to happen more in the open and during the day too. The first instance that was in front of my wife was in our side living room area, and my wife was cleaning the floors. We had a sort of power surge in the kitchen, and her jacket flew off the back of the chair in the dining room, which is next to the kitchen. The table was directly between my wife and I, and we both saw this. Walking into the kitchen, and all the appliances had their times reset like a power surge, but nothing else in the house had any issues. This happened at around 10 a.m. She was obviously very freaked out at this point, and it was then when I couldn't really continue to hide it. I had found various reasons to play things off and cover for excuses, but this was unexplainable. At this point, I was still in monthly therapy sessions to deal with work-related issues. Mental health had improved quite a bit, but things seemed to come in waves as if it was building up strength and feeding on my weaknesses or something. Looking back, it felt like it would build up over several months and get progressively more constant and severe, then sort of dissipate for random amount of times. It would ramp up with events like 1 to 3 times a month and then once a week, then a few times a week to daily even. It would usually build up in severity and then just back to nothing. I would be downstairs in our 2-story home gaming late at night and have lights turn on where I can see them. I would begin to jokingly talk into the open and say things like, "If you're going to turn the lights on, you can pay some of the bills, you know," trying to make light of what was happening. My wife had asked questions on the history of it, and I explained since I was a young child I had issues. She began to ask if we could look into getting rid of this thing. I always told her, unless it's causing harm, I'm not messing with it. The absolute terror of the unknown was enough for me to just deal with it, I guess, but I was a decent horror buff at this point, even though my daily life was basically one. And when thinking about things escalating, I always thought of Paranormal Activity and the scene where they put down flour and now you know the footsteps were goat hooves. You just can't unsee that sort of stuff. I functioned heavily on the ignorance is bliss approach when it came to all of this, and it probably was not the best approach, but it worked for me at the time. Anyway, after this there was a lull of a few months, just long enough to give you some hope that things might be going back to normal. At this point, my wife and I began to start trying for a kid too. I know, the only thing to make this worse would be adding a kid, but here we go. We were having infertility issues though, and this would go on for about 2 years total. And some of the things that we experienced during this time are as follows. I apologize on the chronological order of events for these, but it all becomes muddy after a bit. So I told my wife goodnight, and I went to play some World of Warcraft in my office room. The door was open down the hallway initially, and as I walked closer to the door, it just sort of shut in my face. I proceeded to open it and sit down like it never happened. I truly tried my best to ignore it and move on. But we both tried to function on the thought process of just don't feed into it and hopefully it will just go away. My wife experienced things being thrown 2 different times. To preface, she almost never saw things, or it would only happen when I was home, so for her to see something was pretty significant. The first one, though, was downstairs in our living room while I was upstairs gaming. I had a t-shirt on a coffee table and it was tossed across the room while she was sitting on the couch. And the second was when she was showering. She had our JBL speaker blasting Cardi B or something, and it was thrown off of the bathroom counter onto the floor. I was also home for this one, and I remember it quite clearly. These were obviously some of the bigger events, and weaved in were the constant footsteps and light switches turned on. It also figured out how to turn on the TV and the PS5 downstairs as well. We would wake in the morning and the TV or PlayStation would just be on and idling. Channels never would change and nothing would move on the screen though. Finally though, we got the dumb idea to try and record the downstairs activity while we slept one day. I bought 2 motion sensor cameras and had them set up near areas where things would often happen. When I had cameras recording, not a thing would happen though. When I turned them off, naturally would be the time when things would go bump downstairs. This, along with other examples, leads me to believe this was as intelligent of a haunting as you can pretty much get. Things again dissipated and picked back up like clockwork, and this next experience was worse than it had ever been before. The 3 big notable ones that I will mention are as follows. Again, I apologize for the correct order of events. The first one, though, will definitely be about my dogs. At this point, we now have 2 wiener dogs named Rocky and Sully. I wanted bigger dogs and she wanted smaller, so we compromised and got 2 smaller dogs. My wife went to work out and I was upstairs folding laundry. It was about 10:30 or 11 a.m. and she had gone for about 15 minutes at this point. My dogs were upstairs running around playing. I then heard in my wife's voice, clear as day, say, "Boys, stop barking, it's just Mama." and they stop in their tracks. I was so confused because I was 100% sure that she wasn't home. I called her real quick to see if she stopped back in because, I don't know, maybe she forgot something. And she told me that she had just pulled up to the gym. I left my room to investigate and I found nothing. That was the only instance of things for that day. The next one I can recall was another midday experience where I was home alone. It was around noon and I had just come downstairs for lunch. We had just recently had our anniversary and there was a balloon in the house, and the balloon had originally been in the dining room, and the exits of that room have maybe approximately a 1-foot slip for the doorway to go to the next room. But the balloon had left the room and was actively floating in front of me in the kitchen, slowly bobbing up and down, and it made its way to the back of the living room. For it to be able to leave the initial dining room, it definitely had to be physically moved. It wouldn't have any way to duck into the doorway either. I just stood there watching this in disbelief. But at this point, I had dealt with enough and decided to retaliate. So I grabbed a knife from the butcher's block and popped that balloon, put the knife back, and made some lunch, and I went upstairs. I had one of the dogs in my lap, watching some Twitch stream on my PC when I just felt a burning sensation on my leg. This was maybe about 15 minutes later. I was wearing long jogger-style pants and pulled them up to see what it was, and I saw 3 long scratch marks about 1 inch apart on my thigh. This was the point that scared the absolute heck out of me, and after that, I had just turned to open the room and apologize and said that we were even and I would like to continue to try and live in harmony. And nothing else happened that day. Now, the final experience in this stretch was a little more convoluted, I guess you could say. At work, I had been going through a rough patch with very traumatic calls. I would tend to have very vivid night terrors after these as well. This batch had consisted of a few cases involving juveniles and another person versus a train, and this specific dream was different though. I was in my home and heavy footsteps were sprinting for me. I was screaming my wife's name for help and banging on walls, but no noise was coming out. I felt as if my mouth was being held shut and I was using my hands to pry my mouth free. I had actually awoke and was screaming my wife's name when I woke up, which obviously really messed up the both of us. But this was the peak of the activity for this stretch. After this, things just seemed to die down for about a year. I had been talking with my therapist about the paranormal activity that I was dealing with, as it was a big factor in my mental health. Dealing with death at work all day and then coming home where I'm supposed to be able to unwind and relax was almost worse than working most days. We had discussed the possibility of what this could be and came up with a poltergeist style of haunting which definitely fit the description from what I could find. It basically is described as a malignant haunting that can interact with objects and feeds off of bad energy, which added up with all the depression that I had been going through with work and the infertility issues that we had, up to experiencing a miscarriage as well. At this point, we were able to have a happy, healthy baby girl in December of 2022. I don't really recall much going on at this point. I would say about 6 months into her being around was when things started to pick back up again, slowly as it had. Lights going on and off, footsteps, door handles jiggling to rooms that we're in. The go-tos of the haunting, I guess you could say. We had lightly discussed the issues of having our daughter to be in the same environment as this thing. Ever since the balloon incident, nothing violent or malicious had occurred, but I always had an uneasy feeling and just never felt alone. Around her first birthday, things began to pick up though, and we're back to a daily occurrence. I had tried to keep most of these to myself as to not spook my wife. I figured that if it was just me dealing with it, then I can just bear the burden and move on to keep the peace of everything in the household. For the first time in the history of this though, I was at work on my 24th and she was hearing things while I was away. She was putting our daughter down for bed and was hearing footsteps outside of her room and could see a shadow walking past the doorway. I remember her texting me as it was actively happening, saying that she was done with this, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I was at the end with it too. But going back to the whole question of what the heck to do about any of this, that fear of the unknown just truly paralyzed me. I mean, what happens if we do something and it doesn't work? The house isn't haunted, my wife isn't haunted, it's me. It's followed me from 4 different houses in 4 different cities, and it has no signs of stopping. I had begun to do some research into what the heck I needed to do. I began even asking co-workers if they had anything like this, and they thought that I was absolutely crazy. Not that I blamed them. My lieutenant kept asking if I had any photo or video proof, and I told him that I tried once, but never again. Once I knew what was in there, it would have been game over, to be honest. For Christmas, though, my wife bought me an LED gamertag sign that would light up bright red. It actually came from overseas, so I had to Amazon order an American outlet adapter for it, and once it showed up, I plugged that bad boy in and it was absolutely beautiful. For the time being, I had it sitting on the floor in our computer room, and this specific night, I had told my wife goodnight and went to go and game it up a bit. I turned on the PC and shut the door, and went downstairs to get some G Fuel and snacks. As I was walking up the stairs, I could see a red glow from underneath the door. It turned out that the neon sign had been turned on while I was out of the room. I immediately unplugged it and went about my night. Before I left, I plugged it back in and turned the remote upside down on the table. This was my own little messed up experiment to see if it was moving the remote and turning it on or not, and in hindsight this was dumb, but I mean, here we are, right? That morning when I woke up, it was on. I then unplugged it again and I went to work. A few days had gone by with nothing, and I started to use that LED sign as a ghost gauge, basically. And one night, while I was at work, I got a text from my wife asking if I had left the sign on. I believe that I lied and told her yes for ease of mind, but I knew that I hadn't. After this, there was a stretch of a few nights my wife would work long hours and I was at home with our daughter. During these days, I would hear footsteps upstairs while we were downstairs, and I began to smell something, like perfume. It was the same perfume my nana would wear, and I hadn't smelled that since she passed away many years ago. It was around this time as well that I had also begun to hear a male voice with whispers of incoherent speech, but it always sounded like distant. Over these few days, the whispering got louder and louder, to the point where it was undeniable that I was hearing whispering, but it was always just gibberish. Nothing made sense when I would hear it, and most noticeably would be when I was putting our daughter to bed, and I was lying on the floor of her dark room till she dozed off. I would just hear it constantly. Not really knowing if it was just my nerves being absolutely messed up or if it was real at this point. I didn't tell my wife about this because, yet again, I felt that I should be the one to just bear the burden, but this definitely was my breaking point. For context, it's the beginning of February at this point. Out of a shot of desperation, I tracked down my pastor from my church growing up. My kid was at my parents' house for the day while I caught up on some yard work. I drove down to a local gas station, so I didn't have the conversation in the home, but we limited as much recognition of the entity in the home as much as possible, and this was my day of escaping to call for help. I remember calling him and asking if he had some time to speak. He did remember me from when I would go as a kid, and I told him that I felt that I had something paranormal going on in my life, and I asked if he could listen and hopefully help. He was a little taken aback, but he obliged and let me tell my entire story as I just have here. He had said, "Well, knowing you and the profession you're in, I'm leaning towards the fact that this is real and you aren't having a psychiatric issue or anything. he offered to come out a few days later. He told me that he was going to contact a specific group of people he knew in the Catholic Church, whose job was to deal with exorcisms and get some advice on how to approach this. He gave me the confidence that we would solve it, and at that, I began to cry. I had mixed emotions of terror and joy, hoping this would be the end, but having no clue how this would go. I spoke with my wife about the ordeal, and the pastor was going to come and help us. He asked that we all be present in the house during this ceremony. Once he showed up to the house, he greeted us with a smile and said that he was going to bless the house and us inside of it. We walked with him to each room as he was saying prayers and tossing holy water throughout. The entire time I was waiting for the absolute worst to occur. Every horror movie you see at this point always goes to the worst thing possible and somebody dies. Once he had walked through the house and blessed each room, we then went to the living room and locked hands and prayed. This process took about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm honestly not the biggest religious guy around and mainly went to church because of family, but I was all in on this because we had no other choice, really. Father Doug then gave me the number to what I can describe as the Exorcist hotline. He said if things persist or get worse, that I could call that number immediately and they would help. But it's been about, 6 months now at the time of sharing this, as I lay in my bed at work and things have stopped completely since that day. This is all 100% true, and I have zero proof of any of this, besides the accounts of my family and myself correlating, I guess. Some people are skeptical of ghost stories, and I'm just glad mine is over for now, to be honest. I was inspired to share this and put it down here and have this chapter of my life logged somewhere, so thanks for listening, and thanks for the opportunity to share all of this. I want to start by saying that I really want to believe the things that I've seen or experienced were just my mind playing tricks on me, but it's happened too often for me to dismiss it entirely. I was raised to believe that ghosts don't exist, but I also grew up hearing ghostly experiences from the same people who told me that, so I never truly dismissed the idea of ghosts, I guess. I just feel like we all share a space, and as long as we don't bother each other, it's fine. That said, I want to share the first, very visible paranormal encounter that I had. It was March 2015, and I had just finished my finals that day. After returning from school, I took a nap, felt refreshed, and around 7 p.m. there was a power cut. Power cuts are fairly common where I live, so I decided to pass the time by walking along the pathway leading to our garage, which was between our house and our garden. It was dark, but the moonlight provided enough visibility for me to see. I could see the road outside of our property clearly, but where I was standing wasn't visible to anybody passing by. Like a typical teenager, I stood there listening to music, just doing random things. And after a while, I was standing in front of the garage facing the road when I suddenly felt someone behind me. Before I could turn around, I sensed that this person was bending down towards my right side, and I could see a face behind my right elbow. I turned my head to look, and it was, me. I was staring at myself, but the other me had this huge grin that I'll never forget. Honestly, I've tried to mimic it in front of mirrors, but I physically can't actually do it. I instantly ran, or more like speed walked, back into the house, unable to explain what I had just seen. It was just me and my mother at home at the time, and it wasn't even past 8 p.m. When I told her what happened, she joked that it might have been one of the guys who got murdered on our property in the 1940s. Apparently, our property used to be a well-known garden open to the public, and according to one of my grandfather's friends, 3 murders had taken place in one day there, after which people stopped visiting the garden as much. After this incident, there were other small occurrences that I ignored. At one point, I stayed in the house alone for as long as 5 months, and even during those months, I would experience things randomly. I felt taps on my shoulder, heard clapping, and once I heard what sounded like whispers outside of our living room window. That particular incident actually made me stay awake in the living room until dawn, fearing that we were about to be robbed. That's because I'm more scared of humans than ghostly beings, but these tiny occurrences didn't really bother any of my family members. But then, something happened in early 2023. My grandmother, who has dementia, had moved in with us. We always had someone attending to her so she wouldn't wander off, which she had tried to do multiple times. Grandma had her own sofa in the living room, and she would only ever sit there. This sofa was visible from the dining room, which was connected to my room, so whenever I left my room, I would see her sitting on a sofa. One evening, I decided to take a nap in my room while my mum sat with my grandma. It was just the three of us at home at the time. It was around 4 p.m, everything was fairly bright, but we still had our living room lights on, and instead of taking a nap, I was just sort of scrolling through my phone with my headphones on when my mum suddenly came running into my room. She frantically said something that I couldn't hear over my loud headphones. By the time I took them off, all I could hear was "Help, Grandma," and she ran out of my room toward the kitchen, trying to get to our backyard where my grandma was sitting on the floor. For some reason, she would always sit on the floor, and she was heavy enough that only my dad or I could lift her up. So I jumped out of bed and ran after my mum, but as I passed the living room, I saw my grandma sitting on the sofa. While running, I tried to ask my mum why she was heading to the backyard when Grandma was in the living room. But before I could finish my sentence, I stepped outside into the backyard and saw my grandma sitting on the floor. I stood still for a few seconds, confused, as my mum struggled to lift her up. I eventually composed myself and helped her, and that's when I realized that the grandma who was sitting on the sofa was wearing a completely different dress. I told my parents about this pretty much every evening and also brought up what I experienced back in 2015, and that's when my mum mentioned that she too had experienced some unexplainable things. Nothing as visible as what I had seen, but she had felt things, she said. Since that day, the activities have become more common occurrences. The creepiest one for me was when I felt as if someone was climbing onto my bed while I was on it. My bed was creaking in the same way it does when anyone climbs onto it. I thought that it could be my breathing, so I held my breath for a good 20 seconds and stayed completely still, but the bed was still creaking. I freaked out at that, jumped out of bed and turned on the lights, but as usual, there was nothing there. When I got back into the bed, the creaking stopped. My parents are usually very dismissive of the idea of ghosts, but even they have sensed things that they can't explain. All we know is that whatever or whoever this might be isn't harmful, I guess. Still, I would like to believe that my mind is just making things up. This happened 25 plus years ago. Me and friends, out at a park and boat dock on the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Louisville, probably 25 miles from there, were on a dock that goes probably 30 foot out into the river with a 10 by 10 platform at the end. We're on the Kentucky side, Indiana on the other side of the river. We'd go to this park to sit on the dock and drink and just chat in a cool, quiet place. This was a regular occurrence about every other weekend. We were very familiar with the immediate surroundings, had rotating designated driver duties, and this happened on one of my weekends that I was stone cold sober. So, here's what happened. The group is drinking and having fun as usual. I'm babysitting, which usually entails keeping an eye on the top of the flood wall to see if police show up, and go to talk to them if they do, and make sure nobody falls into the river. About 2 hours in, I see a light on the other side of the river. Not bright, all the way on the other bank, or close to the bank at least. It's almost a mile away, so a little bit hard to tell, and downriver from us. I don't really care, but it's new, so I noticed it. Anyway, about 10 minutes pass and I'm watchdogging and I notice that the light is closer. I'm still not worried, but I'm responsible for a bunch of drunk people, so I'm now adding it to the very short list of things that have my interest. Another 10 or 15 minutes passes and the light has moved up my list of things that I now care about. It's definitely closer now. I'm seeing the reflection of the light on the surface of the water, so I know it's a physical object. I think maybe it's a boat. Bass boats and such have to have marker lights here, and this seems to be about the right height for that. It's maybe about 3 feet above the water, best guess at this distance, but I alert a couple of people that there's something going on that may necessitate our sudden absence. 10 minutes later, and it's now a solid 2 on my care list, and second only to drunk friend about to fall in the river, so I'm watching pretty intently. And all at once, a few thoughts come crashing together to make me do something. So, a bass boat coming upriver against the current would make noise, but I've heard nothing. A boat has its marker lights on the back on a pole, so the light would show the back end of the boat that it's attached to. There's nothing under this light but water. I can see the water under the light, and it's calm. Dead flat calm in a river that is 3/4 of a mile wide at that point. Even if I maybe couldn't hear it, maybe couldn't see it for whatever reason, a boat would create a wake if it's going against the current of the river and all the way across it, and I'm seeing flat glass under its light. Not only no boat wake, but no huge flowing river ripples that were clearly visible on the rest of the surface. No variation in brightness, constant light, color was almost white leaning towards yellow just a bit. And that was it. We were leaving. I tell my friends that it's time to go. We're heading out. Much hullabaloo ensues because drunk people, but we're moving. We walk back to the dock and head for land. Everybody's on land. I'm in the back because that's my job. And alright, everyone's up on the hill towards the parking lot in the car. I look back, and the light is noticeably closer this time. The light is also moving faster than it has been for the last hour or so. So we go and we move. We climb the hill. Everyone is getting in the car except my best friend. We're standing on the top of the flood wall, looking down on the river, the dock and the light. The light is now dead center over the middle of the 10 by 10 platform at the end of the dock. But there's nothing under it but the dock. It's lighting up the area under it, and it's honestly just a light attached to, well, nothing. It's just a light, approximately the size of a light bulb, I guess, probably a bit smaller, lighting up the place that we were just sitting. And now it's moving toward us, crossing above the walkway from the platform toward land and us, and it's moving faster than it was over the water, probably a solid human walking speed now. We all dive into the car at this, and we all just get the heck out of there. My question for all of you guys is, what the heck did we see? What was it doing? Why did it care that we were there at that place that we've been dozens of times before? I'm used to having a probably or even possible explanation for things, but this thing that we saw, I just don't have anything, but I know what I saw, and I don't know what to call it. Several years ago, I had a very quick trip to Denver planned, 23 hours total, to visit a friend before they moved away. I was young, broke, and working a pretty terrible entry-level job, so it was the best that I could do with my one day off. I went straight from work to the airport and got into DIA around 11 p.m. I was bunking on the couch of an old college friend, and they lived 30 to 40 minutes from the airport. Fortunately, the light rail recently had been extended out to the airport, and my friend actually lived near the light rail line. I had taken the light rail often when living in Denver myself, but was not familiar with the newer additions. I barely made it to the train before it set off, grateful to not have to wait around for another half hour at that time of night. It was nearing midnight as the train pulled into a brightly lit Union station. I looked around for my connection, but it was nowhere to be found, not realizing that the connecting line was not there. Fortunately, I was able to flag down security and they pointed me in the right direction. A few blocks away, there was another brightly lit station, separated by roughly 200 yards. Unlike the stations, there were hardly any lights, just some light spilling in from either side where the train platform stood. I was only traveling with a backpack, so I was able to move pretty quickly, moving out of Union Station and towards the other platform, hoping that I was going to make my next train. As I got further away from the station, and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a large figure standing in the middle of the sidewalk ahead of me. I quickly gauged my surroundings and realized that there were no other paths unless I walked in the road. I decided to keep on the path and do my best to come across with a "I see you and I'm not scared" attitude. As I drew closer, I could make out a tall, muscular man, probably in his 20s or 30s, I would guess, and as I got closer, I made eye contact to let him know that I recognized his presence, and he was already staring right at me, mumbling to himself. As I passed by him, I could hear what he was mumbling. He was not speaking to me, but instead he was speaking about me, and as I walked past him, he then began to follow me. I began to walk fast, and he began to walk faster. All the while, he was saying things like, "Oh, look at that body, she's so fine, I want to feel that body," along with other sexual and crude comments about me, all being muttered to himself. The second station was still another 100 yards or so away, and there was nowhere that I could go in between. I pulled out my cell phone and rang my dad, desperate for him to answer. The call went to voicemail, but I pretended that he picked up. As soon as I began talking, though, the man spoke to me for the first time and said, "Oh girl, I didn't mean you no harm," and the footsteps faded back. I kept up the fake conversation for a moment longer, before looking back, and he was nowhere to be found. Like I mentioned previously, I had looked around for places that I could escape and could not find any. I'm confident too with his size that if he had done anything, I would not have stood a chance. I burst into the light of the station, barely made my train, and ultimately missed my stop because I was so shaken up and had to ride the train back around. I finally rested my head on a pillow at my friend's at around 2 a.m. and never to travel alone at night ever again. I recently heard a story here that brought back old memories of my dad's crazy ex-girlfriend. This took place when I was around 8 or 9 years old, so I guess it would have been the year of 1997. So my parents had gotten divorced several years prior, so me and my little sister, 2 years younger, used to stay with our dad every other weekend. One day, he introduced us to this new girlfriend, Rachel, who was a tall blonde woman that had apparently won some kind of beauty pageant or something. I remember those first months of getting to know Rachel as fun. She seemed like a nice lady, to be honest. I also think my initial impression of her was helped by the fact that she had a rather cuddly grey parrot and a pet raven that could talk, which of course made my younger self quite ecstatic. But after a while, things started to change. I began to notice that she could be a bit odd at times, saying weird things or acting a bit strangely. We started seeing her less frequently when staying with our dad, and then one day he told us that they'd broke up and that we wouldn't be seeing her anymore. He also told us that we shouldn't talk to her or go home with her if she showed up at school. Not long after that, Rachel really started harassing my dad. She would randomly turn up at places we went to visit during weekends, trying to talk with us. She called him non-stop on the phone when we were at home, crying, making threats. It usually didn't stop until he pulled the plug even. Years later, I found out that she had even threatened to kill me and my sister on several occasions, and that Dad got a restraining order in the end. Rachel also keyed my dad's car, broke into his company to trash it, and stole a lot of money that he never got back. She even started writing threatening letters to my mum. My parents have always been good friends ever since the divorce, and it all culminated with a letter from the authorities. A letter accusing my dad of, well, lots of horrible things done to children. I still vividly remember how Mum sat us down in our room, holding the letter, a deep look of concern on her face, asking if Dad had ever done anything inappropriate to us, which of course he never had. It later turned out, though, that it was Rachel who had falsely accused him of everything in that letter, in an attempt to prevent him from seeing us. I remember feeling really angry about this, and upset that she had gone to such lengths. The last memory, though, I have of Rachel was a few weeks before Christmas. We were staying at my dad's place over the weekend. It was a 2-story apartment complex with a large window spanning an entire wall, floor to ceiling, in the living room where we had just sat down to watch TV. Next to the window, there was a glass door leading onto a stone patio, bordering a lawn that ended with a tall hedge, and on this particular day, the outdoor lights had been switched off, which means that it was pitch black outside as the intro to Superman started playing. A while into the episode, I suddenly heard a strange, sharp noise coming from the window. It sounded like something was clawing on the glass in an attempt to get in. The sofa that I was sitting on was placed right in front of that window, so I had my back toward it when I slowly turned around to look over my shoulder, heart thumping in my chest, hair standing on end as if I was being watched. But all that came into view was a pitch-black darkness lurking behind my own reflection. By this point, Dad had also heard the sound and gotten up to turn on the patio lights. When the outside suddenly flooded with light, I found myself staring into the face of a smiling blonde woman peering into our living room. Need I tell you that I screamed? Both me and my sister flew up from the couch like it had been scorched with fire and ran behind our dad. When I looked toward the window again, I saw Rachel with both of her hands up against the glass, tightly cupped beside her face, as she was trying to look inside. The patio door was right next to her, and I tugged on Dad's shirt and whispered if the door was locked when she reached toward the handle. And that millisecond of doubt flashing across my dad's face, it still haunts me to this day. Rachel truly looked like a madwoman as she furiously jerked on the handle in an attempt to get in, briefly pausing to peer through the glass now and again. I remember thinking Dad looked oddly calm as he ushered us around a corner wall, telling us to stay out of sight as he walked toward the patio door. We begged him not to go outside, thinking that she could have had a knife hidden somewhere or something. He opened up a small crack with the door, firmly holding onto the handle and asking what the heck she was doing in his backyard. She tried to get him to let her in, putting on a big smile, tossing her hair, but Dad obviously wouldn't budge, telling her to leave or he would call the cops. To which she eventually conceded, leaving a bunch of Christmas presents behind. When Rachel was out of sight from the window, Dad went out to make sure that she was gone, picking up what she had left behind on his way back. None of us wanted anything to do with the presents. Something just felt really off about them. And so, in the end, they ended up fully wrapped and in the trash. This took place back in 2019 when I was 11. My grandparents live in a large Victorian-styled home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The building was made in the late 1800s, so it has that classic old building look to it. Me and my family go down there occasionally from our home up near Bellingham, Washington, and in early September of that year, my family decided that they wanted to pay my grandparents a visit. I was excited to see my grandparents, but not so much to go to the house. Up until that point, nothing out of the ordinary had happened in that house. The only thing it did was creep me out, especially if I was alone. The first day that we were there, though, nothing really out of the ordinary happened. My grandparents and I did our annual game of Clue, a murder mystery board game. We enjoyed dinner, and that was basically about it. Little did I know, though, that when I went to sleep that night that tomorrow would be anything but ordinary. When I got up the next day, I was excited because I was a die-hard Seahawks fan, and today was going to be their first game of the season. Outside it was warm and muggy, so in my room, which was one of the 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, I had the window open with the fan on to let all the hot air out. Later that day, my dad came up to my room and said that he and everyone else was going to go on a walk. I acknowledged him by nodding, glued to the Seahawks game that was on my tablet screen. He then left and shut the door behind him. And what happens next still terrifies me to this day. About 10 minutes later, I heard what I thought to be my mum yelling from downstairs, somewhat annoyed. I stood up and turned the fan off next to the window, so as to listen if my mum was actually calling me, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again. My mum was definitely calling my name. I opened the door, frustrated that I was missing part of the game, and yelled an annoyed, "Yeah?" When there was no response, I yelled down from the 3rd floor stairs again, "Yeah?" Then my mum called back and said something like, "Want to show you this," or something like that. I couldn't really make out what she was saying. Annoyed, but not wanting to ignore my mum, I hurried down the stairs onto the 2nd floor. "Where are you?" I called, genuinely not knowing where she was. "Here," she said. It sounded like it was coming from the 1st floor, but something was off. Her voice sounded very muffled and weird. I played it off as just me being paranoid, so I walked down to the 1st floor, now getting a little bit scared. "Mum?" I said. No reply. I searched almost every room and no one was there. That only left one room, the basement. Now, there was no way in heck I was going down there though, so I started heading back towards the stairs when, all of a sudden, the basement door swung open. I yelled, spinning around, but nobody was there. Then I heard footsteps walking down the basement stairs. Someone was definitely there. I then heard my mum say again, "Here," in that same weird muffled voice. In that instant, I got chills down my spine. Something definitely wasn't right. I turned and ran as fast as I could up the stairs and onto the 2nd floor. I ran across the kitchen to the narrow staircase that led up to the 3rd floor. Then I stopped dead in my tracks, paralyzed with fear. At the top of the staircase was what I can only describe as a shadow-like person, without a face, saying in my mother's voice, "Here." I screamed at the top of my lungs and practically threw myself down the stairs and straight out the front door. I then waited outside near the trees, glancing over my shoulder every 2 seconds before my family finally came back from their walk. When I told them what happened, they didn't believe me at first, but seeing as I was crying and looking genuinely freaked out, they told me that they believed me. I don't know if they were telling the truth or they just wanted me to feel more comforted, but either way, there was no way that I was sleeping in that building that night. After about 10 minutes of reasoning with them, I decided that I would be more comfortable if I slept with my parents that night. This incident still haunts me to this day, and I rarely, if ever, sleep in a room alone in that house anymore. On a quiet winter evening about a year ago, I witnessed something that I can only describe as out of this world. While out on a walk by the 14 Locks Canal Centre in South Wales, UK with my partner, we were walking down the main canal path going down the hill, and about 2/3 of the way down, the canal sort of locks and we decided that we were going to go back because it was dark and pretty miserable. And I suggested to my partner to cut in through the woods because, why not, right? We drove there for a walk after all. There's a small footbridge and a path which connects you to the main dirt path leading back into the car park from there. And when we were in the wooded area, my partner was complaining that she couldn't see because it was pitch black and was genuinely eerily dark. At this point, we were using the phone torches, and I suggested turning the phone lights off to see better because it was that dark that the phone lights just sort of made it worse. So we did, and it did help a little bit. And as we carried on walking towards the main dirt path going back to the car park, as we got onto the dirt path, I spotted something white in the corner of my eye that caught my attention, just by a tree on my 4 to 5 o'clock position, about 12 feet behind me. I turned to get a proper look, and when I looked at it, I was so shook by what I saw that I turned my head away almost instantaneously. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew what I saw, and it freaked me out. About 10 steps later, I said to my partner, "Babe, did you see that?" Of which she replied, "Yes, let's get out of here." As she's saying that too, we glanced behind again, and this thing was right behind us now. At this point, we ran. I mean, we really got on them 10 toes, and we didn't stop until we reached the car park. It's funny how the way back to the car park is uphill, and a pretty respectable walk on a good day, but we sprinted up that hill like it was flat, out of adrenaline and pure fear, I guess. Now, I know what I saw was real, and I honestly shivered inside when she replied acknowledging that she saw it too. This thing, whatever it was bright white in color. I can only describe it as a skinny-ish figure, but the thing is that it wasn't any obvious legs, arms, or features. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall and had a glow to it, and it hovered about a foot off the ground as well. I can remember this day like it was yesterday. It was like a white smudge in the air, roughly the shape of like a round milk ice cream stick, but at the same time a little bit transparent. Now, I'd normally be skeptical of ghosts and all that, but if I ever needed solid concrete proof that ghosts or spirits or, dare I say, alien entities exist, then that was it in front of my face. The fact when I asked her, "Did you see that?" and she instantly said, "Yes, let's get out of here," verified that indeed this thing was there, and I wasn't just seeing things. To this day, even when she talks about this story, she describes the exact same thing I saw, pretty much word for word. I'm glad that she was there because she saw it too, because if it was just me, I'd probably be questioning myself right now, thinking that maybe I didn't see that, but no, we both definitely saw it. I've gone back to 14 Lock since then, just to confirm that there's no signs or posts which could have reflected light or something, moonlight or general light pollution, and basically tried to debunk what I saw in any way possible. But the thing is that there's just nothing there that was the same height or even capable of reflecting light, so this thing was there for sure. Was this a ghost sighting though? Why did it just randomly show up, as I've been through there many times over many years and never seen anything like that before? It clearly knew that we were there, and it was interested in us, considering that the second time I glanced at it, it seemed to have moved closer to us, much too close for comfort in fact. I've heard similar stories elsewhere, and no one believed them either in their stories. But it's crazy to think that there's stuff out there like this. It was 1997. I was 28, and my then boyfriend and I lived in a remote village in Lincolnshire, England. He had a job where he worked from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I was working in a bar, so I would take him to and from work so I could get myself to work with one car that we shared. It's probably worth mentioning too that the car was brand new. It had something crazy like 18 miles on the clock when we got it. I wanted something newer than the car that we had before because I didn't like the idea of being stranded down a dark country lane if the old car decided to just, end itself when I was driving alone. I don't know how many people know Lincolnshire, but most of it is rural with thin winding roads, and the place is so flat that you can see for miles. Now, I used to drive to pick my ex up, and the views in spring when the mornings were getting lighter was and still are absolutely breathtaking. Imagine farmers' fields all around you with basic little roads snaking along the edges. The fields themselves were separated in rows by not quite saplings but trees that would be a couple of years old, still thin and a bit gangly, and at this particular time of year were just starting to show hints of new leaves on their skinny branches. An absolutely beautiful drive in the lighter mornings, mainly because I was usually the only person on the road, so I could also drive as slow as I liked to watch the sun coming up over the horizon. So, I hope I've described the place enough to paint a bit of an image. And here's what happened. So one morning I was driving along the little road. It was about 5:30 in the morning and the sun was just peeking out on the horizon and the sky was completely cloudless. I slowed down to watch it as I often did, not paying much attention to the trees as they were in a row that ran down the side of the field, so they were never in the way of the view. When in my peripheral, I thought that I saw something move against the skinny trees. So I stopped the car completely, thinking that it might be a deer or something interesting like that. I waited for a few seconds and nothing happened, so I was just about to restart the car when I saw two of the trees walking out of the lineup. I say trees, but I don't have a clue what they actually were. Remember, this is a long time before the internet and the Slender Man and all the tales and superstitions, etc. I was literally frozen to the spot with fear. Two tall things walked out of the line of trees and started walking over to me. I was about 50 to 60 yards away from them, and the only thing that I could describe them as were oversized stick insects. They had 2 long legs and 2 long arms that almost touched the ground, and I'd say the tallest one must have been easily 12 feet tall, the smaller one maybe 10. They walked in a fluid motion, as if they were wading through treacle, almost like long hair would glide through water. It was just slow and very graceful. When my brain finally kicked into flight mode, I started my car and glanced over to see how close they had gotten. All the while, I was putting my car into gear and started it moving. The tallest one slowly lifted his arm up, like a silk scarf gliding through light wind, and pointed it at me. And it was then that my car instantly stalled. The dashboard warning lights were all on, all of them lit up, and at the same time I just got the worst pain in my face all of a sudden. Mainly my jaw, but it made me scream out in agony and I almost blacked out. With the pain debilitating me, I knew that I needed to get away, fast. I was so terrified that the car wouldn't start again because all the lights were still on. So I turned the engine entirely off and thankfully it started again, and I drove like a mad woman to get out of sight. All the time my face or jaw was burning, and when I got to my ex's work, he gave me a bottle of water to cool me down, but it didn't do much to help. And for weeks, my mouth felt like I had chewed on poison ivy, my jaw feeling like I had an abscess under each molar. I needed to see a dentist, and I knew that, but explaining what had happened would have made me feel stupid, so in the end I put it off. I had 3 amalgam fillings, all of my lower molars, and once the worst of the pain had gone, a couple of months later, weirdly I couldn't put anything metal in my mouth without getting a shock, like licking a battery shock. So I was eating with plastic cutlery all the time, and decided to give in and see if the dentist would change the fillings to ceramic ones. The dentist looked in my mouth and asked what had happened to my teeth. I played it off casually and asked why, because my fillings apparently looked like balls of mercury. So I explained the car ride, etc., and he said that my fillings looked like they had melted and pulled into smooth, rounded metal balls. I can assure you, too, that every word of this is true. I don't mind banter or questions, but please just don't be mean. It's taken a lot for me to tell this story to you all, and I hope you can appreciate that. I lived in this farmhouse from 2 to 10 years of age, and my mum said ever since we moved there that I would tell her every morning that somebody was sitting at the foot of my bed. I don't recall this because I was so young, but I do remember going to sleep in my brother's room across the hall because the shadow man was in my room. One morning, my mum woke me up for school and said, "Come on, get up." She went to the shower next to my room, but when I finally went to move, I felt something grab my ankles and a low growl sound. I absolutely just froze at that and remembered the anxiety that I felt and my eyes watering too. The feeling let up and I went to move again very slow and it did it again. My mum came in and was mad, saying, "I said you need to get up," which I replied, "I can't, something is grabbing me." At that point I was able to get up again. I don't know if this was sleep paralysis or, well, what it was, but I also remember that we had a cat, Oreo, and she never slept with me. So one night I carried her to my room and shut the door so that she had to sleep with me. The minute that I sat her down, she ran under the bed and growled so loud, meowing in distress. She jumped up onto the bed on my chest, swatting my face, and bit me, and then ran back under the bed growling again. I remember leaping from the bed scared that she was going to bite my ankles, and when I opened the door, she sprinted out of the room. I didn't think anything of it at the time until I got a bit older. There's honestly many more stories to that house as well. Me and my brother both saw the shadow man and watched him reach up to the shelf on the wall. On the shelf was a big glass unicorn my mum got from Mexico. He touched it and it fell to the ground and shattered. My parents woke up from it and we told them the shadow man did it, but obviously they didn't believe us and thought that we had done it. And we still remember this to this day. Before we inherited the house, my dad's uncle lived there alone, and one day he came home and had a heart attack in the front door and fell down the steps and wasn't found until later. My mum also said at night that she'd hear a 5-gallon bucket being tossed back and forth in the basement for some reason. But perhaps the scariest thing is that I reached out to the owners who bought our farm. I asked them if anything unusual happens in the house, and they responded with a text message. It read, "I know at least a few times they have. I don't remember anything specifically besides one time Lauren was putting his boy to bed when he was young and Trayton told him that there was someone in the doorway and that he hung out up there sometimes when obviously there wasn't." That message sent chills down my spine. I live in Ohio, a rural community, and this happened in the early 1990s. My girlfriend and I were at a local nature area. There's a small fish pond there, county roads to the north and east, woods to the west and the south. My truck was facing kind of northeast, I guess. It was near dusk and we were sitting on the tailgate of my truck just talking, listening to music and all that. There were a few other people at the park at that time. And as time went on, other cars left the park and it started getting darker. The mosquitoes were getting pretty bad, so we decided to get into the truck. We sat there a little while longer. Radio was on, but low volume as we continued talking. We were just sort of getting to know each other, so there was a lot to talk about at the time. When we both heard a sound, like a thumping or a banging sound coming from the wooded area, but it seemed far away. I turned off my truck radio and we just listened. Some dogs were barking in the distance, but we didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off, turned my radio back on, and we just went about our business. I should say here too that my truck ignition was off, was just an accessory to run the radio really, so no engine noise and no headlights. After a few minutes, we hear a similar sound again. Same response, turned off the radio and just listened, but nothing. I decided to just leave the radio off at this point. We were talking about getting ready to head out and go into town anyway. But then, and I'll describe this as best as I can, things went wild. A sound that I can only describe as a choir of voices suddenly started. There was what sounded like stringed instruments replicated by a pipe organ. The voices were chanting words, but I can't tell you what language it was. I didn't recognize any of the words, but it was an ominous, very unsettling chanting in a higher register. And it sounded as if the sounds were coming from, well, every direction. It was in no way a pleasant sound. It instantly filled me with fear and dread because it felt evil. It was as if the truck was surrounded too, and I quickly reached and started my truck and turned on the headlights, fully expecting to see a ring of robed figures surrounding us. As unlikely and crazy as that sounds, that is what my thoughts were preparing for based on what we were hearing. I have a hard time sharing just how intense the sound of the chanting was, but it sounded close, like they were right outside of the windows. But as soon as the headlights came on, there was just, well, silence. Nothing. Nothing running away, no sound other than my engine. Everything was completely normal. Without saying anything, I put it into drive and we tore out of the parking area and we headed south. Once we got away from there, we recounted what had just happened. Neither of us had an explanation, but agreed on one thing. It was, without a doubt, the most frightening and unexplainable thing that we had ever experienced. I guess I'm not looking for an explanation. I realize how fantastical this sounds, but every word of it is true. I shared what happened with a couple of my friends the next day, but it's a story that I've pretty much kept to myself over the years, sharing only with a few people that would appreciate it. I don't talk about this much. It's also been many years since this happened, but this experience, it definitely still haunts me. So I was incarcerated in county jail for a year. My time spent was in lockdown. I could never pay attention to the exact time of day or night since the block clock was never maintained. I do know that it was quiet hours of the early morning before sunrise, though. Multiple days, I would see shadows and reflections through my window into the great room. I would regularly see silhouettes walk past my window, and I would often dismiss them as guards taking rounds checking on us inmates to ensure that we were still present. There would be times, however, that my curiosity would get piqued when I would see a passing shadow, but never heard any doors open or close from the guards in the bullpen. I would climb out of my bunk and try to look left and right out of my door's window, but never saw a guard returning to his post. Now, after weeks of seeing this same phenomenon, I finally saw something that sent shivers down my spine. One night, while I was reading a book, I just couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. I was used to the passing shadows by this point, but as I mentioned, they were always passing. This was something else. I don't remember ever seeing it appear or leave. It was as I can only describe as omnipresent, but it felt as though it had always been present, just waiting and watching. Only this time it allowed me to observe it, perhaps, almost like it just materialized. There were no shapes, no discernible edges, just a void, a black hole as deep as space itself, and in the middle were two piercing red eyes. I could never steel myself enough to make direct contact, but I didn't need to know that it was there. I could feel its gaze in my peripherals, and I was prey, and it had been stalking me, and both of us were just waiting for the other to make the first move. All I could do was pretend that I didn't notice it, hoping that it would lose interest. At some point, not knowing how much time had passed, I eventually fell asleep. It only appeared the one time. The only other person I've ever shared that story with is my partner, but never in as much detail. I appreciate you guys for taking the time to hear me out on this, and also for this safe place where someone can feel comfortable to share their deepest fears. When I was 13 years old, I used to leave the school during lunch break and accompany my friend, as she used to eat her lunch at home. a custom in UK schools, and then come back to school once lunch had ended. I wasn't supposed to eat lunch from home, but managed to trick the teachers, and this was due to being pressured by my friend to join her. Her house was only a 2-minute walk away, and I remember that you had to pass by an alleyway which looked very creepy, and anytime we walked past the alleyway, I would get this sort of unsettling feeling. Well, one day, it was a Friday, and I really didn't want to leave with my friend, but she would peer pressure me all the time. I remember the weather being really bad. It was raining heavily. The sky looked grey and dull, and there was a huge wind outside. I kept telling my friend that we should just stay at school this time, but she insisted that we go to her house. We exited the school gates and walked up the street to head to the alley, which you had to get to the top of the street and then turn left. I was casually walking, and I noticed my friend was no longer beside me. She had this sort of deer-in-the-headlights look and was frozen still. That's when I could see a guy walking towards our direction who was covered all in black, and only his eyes were visible. My friend tapped me on the shoulder to gesture me to turn around, and she started speed walking with me closely behind her. It didn't take us long to get all the way back to school, as we were already near the area, and my friend starts running as we reached the gates and screamed loudly. I freaked out and asked her what was wrong, and she told me that the man was carrying a knife. I remember being visibly freaked out by that, and we told a friend about it, who told us to speak to these teachers, who then called the police. The police took our statements separately while we were both at home, but later stated that we were lying because our answers didn't match up. I don't remember the exact questions, but I remember the wording was confusing. They would ask me how many feet the man was away from us, and would tell me to compare my answer to a bus or a car. They did check the CCTV footage and saw both me and my friend running, but no footage of the man. Years later, I would be somewhat haunted by that incident too. That whole area used to freak me out, and I remember a murder happening in the same area where 2 elderly women were stabbed to death. During my early 20s, I used to do voluntary work at a hospital and once decided to walk into that area to go home. And I felt freaked out, and I decided to not go there ever again. To set the scene, we're a bunch of young girls in high school, year 8. Of course, we've all heard about Ouija boards after watching scary movies, and we all wanted to try it. One afternoon after school, but before we did the board, we went into an abandoned home in our small town. One of the girls said that a local teen had beat the older man to death that had lived there apparently. It was creepy, and I remember feeling like we just shouldn't have been in there. But there we were. And regrettably, I think, we were really rough in there too, picking up random pieces of junk and just throwing it around, just being a bunch of dumb and disrespectful teens. There wasn't any real furniture or belongings, but we were still being jerks, and anyway, we leave, and in an empty paddock just across from the creepy dead man's house, we decided that this was a great spot to summon spirits. What was wrong with us, right? Anyway, I can't remember which one of us made the board, not me, but we 4 sat down in a circle and did all the usual mumbo-jumbo questions. Now, I wish that I could remember exactly what the spirit board said, but I know that I took my hand off the planchette in fear a few times, and so did the others too. Of course, we didn't say goodbye or any of that. We all got freaked out by a spirit named Bob, and that was that. Time went on, and I no longer talked to those childhood friends. Not to do with this spooky stuff, but I can't find out again exactly what they experienced, but I'm also still freaked out about the stuff that started going down and wouldn't know how to even start that conversation, to be honest. But over the next few weeks or so, at least 2 of my friends said that they had really messed up dreams. I then started being woken up at 3 a.m. every night. Bang on 3, I would just wake up and feel really creeped out and look over at the digital clock to see what the time was. I was so scared that I was sleeping with the lights on, but it would still happen. I had started having general anxiety too and bad panic attacks, but I just didn't know what was happening. I thought that I was going mental, but I just kept it all to myself. As it so happens, while all this negative stuff was happening, my parents had recently split and I was in the process of moving interstate with just my mum. My friends had thrown me in a going away party and invited half the school year. I remember not having a good time at all during the party because of my anxiety, but everyone else was running wild and having a good time, so I suppose it was okay. Pretty late that night, a small group of people came back after going for a walk though, and they had tried messing around with the spirits again. One of my year mates, a guy, was so distressed and he kept saying that he saw a vision of his family dying. So what do a bunch of 14 to 15-year-olds drinking and partying do? Ignore it and carry on. I, for one, was not wanting a bar of that though, and a few weeks later, and it's moving time for myself and my mum. All my furniture was packed up, but because my dad was staying in the house, I just slept on the couch in the lounge room. The weird 3 a.m. wakings up had been still happening, but not every night now. But this last night in the family home was absolutely terrifying. I went to sleep on the couch and it was pitch black in the lounge room. I was dreaming a bunch of nonsense as usual, and in the dream, I was in our backyard near the clothesline. I remember seeing some friends and family members, and then all of a sudden they all dropped to the ground like they died. I then heard my name being called, clear as day, but it was some weird, twisted voice. I woke up in the dead of night, and it was darkness all around. I looked around the darkness, and then I looked down to the foot of the couch, and there, standing there, was a dark and big manly figure, just looking over me. I distinctly remember knowing someone was there, and I sort of weakly called out, "Dad." There was no answer. At this point, I tried to look for some eyes or a face or something, but all I could see were these red-looking eyes. And I know that they were a faded color, but red-colored eyes were definitely there staring at me. Think of any time you've woken up in the dark and tried to find whoever was disturbing you. You can sort of see them and know that they're there, but it's not super clear, right? Whatever or whoever was there, they were a bad presence. Well, then, I think I did what any other kid would do and put the blankets over my head and tried to breathe quietly. I was wishing whatever it was to just go away and everything would be okay. I couldn't tell you how long I was under the covers for and trying to breathe from a tiny part that I made in the covers, but I somehow fell asleep for a tiny bit when the sun started to rise again until my mum woke me up. Of course, I didn't tell my mum or anyone what had happened. It was such a surreal thing to experience as a 14-year-old going through all the other hormonal and high school stuff that I just moved to the other state, tried to integrate into school and put it all in the back of my mind. But I just knew that bad juju was going to stay back at the old family house, now my dad's place. Over the next year and a half, a lot of changes happened with family, and I did end up living back at that house, studying a diploma in music that I could only do in Sydney. There was only one more incident not long after I moved back in, but man, was it scary. I was home alone and I was sitting at the computer desk. It was situated behind a wall, and if you looked through the doorway just to the right of the desk, you could see the kitchen and the small living area. I was messing about on MSN Messenger at the time and then felt a sudden shot of unease come over me. Then I heard a loud bang like someone had slammed the oven door shut, but so loud, and even the lights flickered a bit. It was just the yuckiest, scariest feeling that I'd ever had. I jumped up and looked into the kitchen and I couldn't see anything. I then ran out the back door and grabbed the cordless landline on my way out and called my dad. I would have sounded mad to him, I know, but all I could say was something was weird in the house and please come home soon. I don't remember what happened ghost-wise moving forward after that. I guess I suppressed a bit and then got busy with life, but I do know that I used to sneak into pubs with my TAFE friends and come home pretty, messed up, and that obviously helped a bit, I think. Then I grew up and eventually I moved out. But those memories I still have are so freaky. In the end, my advice is don't mess with Ouija boards when you're a dumb teen. Or, in fact, ever. When I was little, my parents bought the house that belonged to my dad's grandparents. I'm not sure how long the home was in my family, but I do know that my grandma lived there as a little girl. Now, when I was little, tiny in fact, I slept over my aunt's house for the night and my brother went to his uncle's house. The only people in the house were my mum and dad. My mum tells me that they were in their room at night next to a door that had a staircase that went to a bedroom upstairs. They said that they heard my voice calling Mum over and over again, upstairs and then on the staircase. They both recall the same thing, hearing my voice. I wasn't home though, so they went outside the house and looked for neighboring kids, but it was night and no one was outside. The family next to us was from a different country and did not call their mother traditional mum as well, and they knew that. Eventually I grew up a bit and I was going through puberty in this house, so I was already losing my mind as a kid, but I recall some very concerning moments in my young life there. I lived upstairs in that room and I was going through it as one does, but I was only about 9 and thought about putting something on my neck and floating, if you catch what I mean. And I tried, but luckily I was immature and didn't succeed. The upstairs had a staircase and it was open with white wooden balcony around it so you could look down. And that room, it still gives me the creeps. When I was younger, my aunt's boyfriend's brother died on train tracks a couple of miles from the house, and you could hear that train come through at night. The night of, I slept in the living room and woke up at dawn standing on my tippy toes looking at a window that was next to the fireplace at the sky. At this time of the morning, the sun was coming up and there were stars out. I could hear the train, and when I woke up later, my mum had told us that he had died. I think about this a lot. On another occasion, I was in my upstairs room and we had it split down the middle. My sister's crib was by the stairs and I was on the other side of the room. We split it off by her closet and my little couch that I got from a garage sale. You couldn't see the closet doors from my bed, just the back of it. I was texting on my little flip phone and a towel flew and hit the wall. I was so scared that I couldn't move. I refused to be in that room anymore after that too. I decided to move into the basement of the house when I was in 6th grade. I had a folding cot, an old TV. It was going to be my space. I suffered from sleep paralysis pretty much every single night, and I felt watched, uneasy and sick down there. My mum told me that my grandpa built the basement out. I'm not too sure about the basement, but it was not a good place to be, I'll tell you that much. We all heard footsteps down there, multiple times, shutting doors, running in the basement. Unfortunately, that was the most scary, but before we moved out, I took a school photo of myself and hid it in the baseboards of the stairs of the scary upstairs room. I doubt it's still there, but I heard the new owners gutted it years ago and grey flipped it. But here's my dilemma. I've been having nightmares about this house ever since we moved out years and years ago. We moved out before I went to middle school. I'm in my 30s now. It's been a hot minute since I've been at that house, but my dreams are always supernatural, about me in the house as an adult. The most recent dream was about a demonic spirit telling me that I needed to paint a picture of a window with green ivy around it. The upstairs room's window next to my bed, the wall outside was covered in ivy. It completely took the house on that side too. And it also told me that I needed to paint myself at the window. I told my husband this, and He said absolutely not, that it sounds like a trap and some conjuring stuff. I agree, but I really feel like I should paint it, and I'm not sure why I feel so inclined to do it. The house has been haunting me ever since, and we've all had supernatural experiences there, even my grandma as a little girl. I've always been around paranormal stuff. It used to happen to my mum all the time before I was born, apparently. I've heard all the stories, so it was somewhat familiar. The first time something ever happened, and I haven't been able to explain it, was when I was about 11. I had woken up early-ish in the morning, and I heard this bang on my closet door. It wasn't like a normal bang, too. It sounded like someone had hit my door with an open hand from the inside. I swear that I could feel the outline or sensation of that hand, too. My first initial thought was that someone was hiding in there, so I went to open it, and nothing was there. Safe to say, I was petrified at that point. The day went on, and I sort of forgot about it, until the same thing happened the next morning at around about the same time. I jumped that time, and I went and had a look again, but there was nothing there. This happened consistently every morning for a while too, and it just became normal to me, but then I told my mum. She tried debunking it, but none of it made any sense. She told me, though, that if it is something paranormal, I apparently needed to stand my ground and say that I don't like what it's doing and this is my house. So I heard the bang and said what my mum told me to say. I can say that it didn't like that a second after that too, because it hit my closet door way harder, followed by this massive scrape like sharp nails going down all the way down the door sound. But after that, it stopped happening so often, and then suddenly it just stopped. I talked to my mum, telling her that it stopped, and then she said while I was away that she apparently cleansed my closet. Several years later, I'm still in the same room, and I haven't heard it since. There's been other experiences, but not the same way that this one made me feel, and it was something about the aggression of the hitting that has always just sat with me. This happened around 2021, and sometimes I still find it hard to grasp. For context, I now live in a different place, and along with most of my relatives, so I feel safer saying this here, I guess. The reason I'm sharing this is for people to learn and possibly caution themselves from my experience. Now, I'd say the place that I lived in was just pretty old. It wasn't densely populated, nor empty either. It had wooded areas around it that you could cycle to the mall through, school as well, and other normal places, but you'd have to take a car to go to places like the hospital. I was basically in my last year of high school at this point, and being an only child and a girl on top of that made my parents overprotective, and I was naturally more cautious than the rest of my friend group. I didn't really mind being that way, though, because I always thought that that was the better option anyway. So teenagers from school would have these sort of outdoor get-togethers in the woods a few kilometers away from my school. It was just common for people to lounge out and about, chilling till like 3 a.m. or whatever. And including me, it was a group of 4. They decided since it was our last year that we should probably drink together in the woods. Obviously, looking back, that was a really stupid idea. It wasn't unsafe, I guess, and it wasn't deep in the woods either, but still. There's a pretty clear trail though, and a small sort of openish area where people would get their dogs and whatnot. We planned to do it on a Thursday because my parents would be out and the rest would convince theirs that we were having a sleepover. Now, we bought the alcohol and some other stuff just to chill out. There were no others that day because it was a weekday and quite chilly as well. It was pretty lively. You could see houses from the distance and people would be driving around and all, so naturally we felt pretty safe. We walked on the trail for about a minute when, for whatever reason, I just felt really uneasy. I felt like we were being watched or something like that, and looked over to one of my friends. she looked a little bit distressed too, but I guess we just sort of shrugged it off in the end. We walked a few more minutes and we found our spot. We started drinking and basically spent like an hour and a half of gossiping and having those sort of deep talks while you get drunk. I didn't drink too much and neither did my other friend. We were just a little bit tipsy. Now, we forgot about the brief weird feeling that we had felt while walking until we heard something from thick in the trees in front of us. Even though we were loud, we all heard it too. It was this sort of weird sort of snickering or giggling. I got up from this tree log that I was sitting on and just dragged my friends back a little bit. We had a fire going and 2 torches, but still couldn't really see into that area. It wasn't that close to us. I think about maybe 4 doors away if you place them horizontally. So the fact that we heard that laugh was just sort of insane to me. I pointed the flashlight into the area and nobody came out. I sat back down and when I turned the flashlight off, there was a silhouette coming out. I switched on the flash to blind that person while my other friends did the same. We started yelling and getting ready to run when I saw what I can only describe as the most horrifying thing that I have ever seen. It was this man who we'd never seen before. He had this sort of plaster-like smile and his hair was covered in dirt. He was completely pale and his eyes were almost like he wasn't looking at us but just in our sort of general direction. It's difficult to explain just how creepy this was, but it was textbook creepy. We all ran for it. My very drunk friends even managed to snap out of it. We got to my house eventually. I lived the closest to the place and said that we would call the cops. We absolutely terrified our parents as well, but yeah, we called the cops and in the end they found nothing. Word eventually got out and people pretty much stayed away from the paths at nighttime, and a couple of the guys in our school managed to get their dads and all with guns to find the guy, but nothing ever really came of it. Anyway, fast forward to maybe about a month later, but we didn't talk about it much and we never did anything like that again either. I got a pocket knife and some pepper spray to keep on me at that point as well. I went home after school and I was exhausted this day, so I decided to take a nap in the end. My dad was at work and my mum was visiting her sister. But I suddenly woke up to this weird sound. We had a 1-story and the walls were not too thick, so you could hear things all the time. Even still though, I had a bad feeling, so I locked all the doors and even the windows out of habit. Still, fearing for the worst, I also locked my room door and kind of looked out my window. There was nothing at this point. I grabbed a bat and my phone, heading out of my room. I looked at all the doors and everything was locked. But there was this weird, shuffling outside of my house, and I looked through the windows of my living room, and I kid you not, it was the same dude from the woods. He was just outside, walking in this erratic, eerie way, which honestly just sent me into a complete spiral. He somehow saw me and started saying hi there very loudly. I called the police, and after that I told him to get lost. After he started saying my name and all my friends' names as well. The police, they eventually got here and they actually got him this time. They questioned him and he had no history of mental illness or anything. He had no clinical disorder, and after enough questioning, he finally confessed to liking young women. He is apparently in jail now for other related reasons, but he'll probably get out in a couple of years, and to be honest, I'm kind of worried about that. Especially because he was guilty of attempted sexual assault and harassment. And the worst part is, that's all I know about. So I grew up on a farm in Max Creek, Missouri, literally in the middle of nowhere. My mum and my dad, they always told me about this old farm called the Arnholtz Farm, and that it was supposedly haunted. My mum used to be friends with a lady who lived there in high school, and when visiting once, saw a man standing at the top of the stairs, so they called the police. They come to find out later that it was the man who apparently ended himself there in the house. A bit of backstory before I begin as well. One man, he shot himself in the house and another hung himself in the barn, and it had a really nice family cemetery just down the hill. That's just how it was back in the days. Cemeteries were often on private land. My dad told me his younger brother David had taken a date for a drive and saw what looked like candlelight in the windows. There had not been anyone living on the farm for years at this point. So one day, I decided to go and check it out for myself. My grandfather owned the land after all, so it wasn't like I was going to get into trouble or anything. This was also in late August. So there was a good walk up a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, maybe about 30 minutes. I got to the middle gate and I climbed over, and this is where things started to get interesting. You see, as soon as I got over the fence, I felt like something was watching me. I shrugged it off and started down the small path, which was just big enough for a pickup to drive down. As I started to walk, I noticed something was walking in the woods on my right, keeping stride with me step for step. I figured maybe a deer or wild turkeys, so I kept going down the road, but the steps kept the same pace as me and were literally parallel to me in the woods. I started to get creeped out, so I did a bit of a test to see what would happen. I would change the pace of my walk from fast to slow, and whatever it was doing the same. So to really test it, I just took off at a dead sprint, and so did it. And then I stopped, and it did too. I challenged whatever it was to stop messing around and to come out and face me, but nothing. By this time, I had gotten to the clearing where the house was along with the barn. The path had a sort of mid-turn to the right in a clearing with the house on the right and the barn to the left. Once I made it to the clearing, whatever was following me didn't follow me out of the woods. The house was really starting to fall apart as well. Whoever lived there had a thing for roosters because there were paper clippings all over a wall. I couldn't go upstairs because the floors were sagging. I went and checked out the barn at one point. The rope that the man had used, it was still there, and you could see that it was frayed from where they had cut him down. I went just down the hill to the left of the barn and paid my respects to the family buried in the small cemetery plot. I spent maybe 2 hours just checking the place out. It was starting to get late, so I figured that I had better get heading home anyway. And just as soon as I got around the bend into the woods, whatever was in there, it started up with walking stride for stride with me again, but on the opposite side of the trail. This went all the way to the gate. It literally followed me right up to the gate. I climbed over the gate, and as I was walking away, I heard it walk up to the gate and stop. I turned around, and there was nothing. I was only 4 or 5 steps away, so I should have been able to see something, but there was nothing there. I ended up nervously saying, "Have a good day" to whatever it was, and in the end I just left. I never did go back to that place, but I guess now I sort of would like to just see it again. So one night, me and my friends were playing some hide-and-seek in our hometown. We were probably about 13 at the time. I went into a small area that is basically sort of like a shortcut from the main road to the side road. I unfortunately went alone, and I didn't even think of what could happen. I remember that we were only 13 at that time, and we didn't bring phones with us, so if something actually happened to us, nobody would have even known. The game started, and I ran sprinting into the woods area. The first 30 seconds were pretty good. Disclaimer too, we have a rule that we have to come to the checkpoint where we start, and we have to save ourselves from not getting picked to search or whatever. But after around maybe a minute, I start hearing footsteps. I say, "Hello," "Are you one of my friends?" And something that was there didn't say anything. So I started backing out. Fortunately, the woods area has a main route and 2 side ones, so I could have run either way. I start backing out, and from nowhere, this man just appears from the woods and starts sprinting at me while saying, "I'm going to catch you," in a creepy and sort of eerie way, like a kidnapper, I imagine. Fortunately, at that time, I trained football or soccer, so I was pretty confident that I could outrun him, or at least make him tired. I pretty much sprint all the way through the woods, with the only light being the moonlight, and after around 2 minutes, he eventually gave up. I continued sprinting, and I got myself all the way to the checkpoint, and told all of my friends what had just happened. Of course, no one believed me, but I didn't care since I knew it was real. We ended up ending our game early that night, just out of caution. And to this day, I still don't know who or what had tried to catch me that night. But for sure, I know that if I hadn't have trained like I had as a young guy, the outcome would have possibly been very, very different. I have always experienced paranormal things, and my earliest memory of anything paranormal was age 4. I have many stories of things that I've witnessed in my lifetime, but this is one from my time living in rural Missouri. In 2009, I moved in with my boyfriend, now husband, and his family. They lived in a beautiful farmhouse on several acres of land. The nearest neighbor was probably a half a mile down the road, so it was very quiet. This home has a large basement that was basically a 2-bedroom apartment, and that's where my husband and I lived. As soon as I moved in, though, I started to notice strange sounds and see things. I didn't mention these things to him because, well, I didn't want him to think that I was crazy. It would take me a long time to share every single instance of what we witnessed, but I'll tell you the ones that still scare me to today when I think back. Now, right outside of our bedroom door was a long hallway that led to the staircase and another bedroom. We were the only 2 people to ever go into the basement, and one night we were already in bed watching TV. We began to hear extremely heavy footsteps pacing up and down the hallway. It was so heavy that we thought maybe someone had broken into the house and was wearing heavy work boots or something. We turned the television off and started to listen closely. It would pass by our door and seem to go towards the end of the hall, and then would sort of double back near the door. At this point, our dog was growling and looking towards the door. With the TV off, the bedroom was pitch black dark as well. My husband called out hello, and the sound of the boots, they stopped. He started to text his mother, the only other person home that night. He asked her if she was downstairs, and she responded shortly after that she was sleeping. My husband started to get up and find out what was in the house. He made it about halfway to the door, and all of a sudden the door literally flew open. It was with such a force that the doorknob knocked a small hole in the wall. At that point, our dog went absolutely crazy and was barking and ran to hide under a table. The bedroom was extremely dark, so my husband tried to hurry and turn the lights on. Lights come on and silence. He runs into the hallway to look around. We both searched the entire basement, but we found nothing. Another night, we were sitting in the living room area in the basement watching television. Behind the living room area was a kitchen area that had a bit of a long bar there. We had a few bar stools up on the bar and a telephone on a charger. This particular night, we were the only ones at home as everyone else had gone out to dinner. We start to hear a weird sound, almost like someone was moving furniture across the floor. We sort of lower the volume on the TV so that we can hear things better. We hear something moving again. All of a sudden, though, we hear a very loud crashing sound right behind the couch. We then feel something hit the back of the couch. We both jumped up terrified and looked behind us. 2 of the bar stools that were on the bar are now on the floor behind the couch. Keep in mind the kitchen area sat back about 14 or 15 feet from where the couch was, and if they simply fell somehow, there was just no possible way they could have traveled like that. The phone that was on the other end of the bar was about 10 feet away on the floor and ripped from the charger. We looked around, looked at each other, and we literally ran up the stairs and outside until we calmed down a bit. I was absolutely terrified and feared the basement after that moment. We then started to see what looked like, I want to say, a possible shadow figure standing in the doorway. Each time we would see it, it was just standing there and would slowly move away. It got to the point that we would try to ignore it until it went away. We told his mom and stepdad, and they told us that they saw and heard things frequently too. We would be upstairs and hear the toilet flush in the bathroom. We would then hear the water in the sink turn on and then silence. At night, if we came upstairs and walked through the house while the lights were off, you would always feel as though you were being watched. Then, we made the mistake of trying to hold a seance one evening. We wanted to ask and see what was there, or maybe what they wanted. We were sitting in the kitchen upstairs in the main part of the house. There's a sort of arched doorway to the exit kitchen, and just to the right as you walk through the arched doorway were the stairs leading back down into the basement. Now, as we're asking if anyone would like to talk to us, we hear what sounds like someone running up the stairs from the basement. They were very heavy footsteps and unmistakable. His mum and little sister were with us at the table that day, and all four of us jumped up, scared like we'd never been. We all looked at the doorway to see who was coming up those stairs, and as soon as it seemed like it was nearing the top of the stairs, it went absolutely dead silent. We all had to go outside until we calmed down a bit and had the courage again to go back in. These are just a few examples out of many more things that we witnessed while we were living there. I asked my husband if he had ever noticed any of these things happening before now, and he said that things happened, but nowhere near as bad as once I moved in. His mother told me the same thing too. We ended up going to the library and speaking with a local historian, and she told us that in the late 70s, a young woman had actually ended her life there in that home. And, yep, you guessed it, in the basement. She told us that a young woman who lived in the home had become very depressed. She apparently hung herself in an area right by the basement kitchen, which immediately things started to make a whole lot more sense at that point. I have so many more experiences in that house. If anyone would like to hear them at some point, then leave a comment below and maybe I'll write some more up for all of you guys to hear. But for now, this will have to do, and if you got this far, then thanks for listening. I'm quite a bit older now, but there's this memory that I have from when I was around 7 or 8 that I've never been able to stop thinking about. So, I was laying in bed asleep and swaddled in so many blankets that it was actually difficult to move. I awoke to an odd feeling that I was being watched. I picked up and saw a figure staring at me. I couldn't make out its face, but it had the same silhouette and height my brother did. It was also wearing a striped shirt and jeans that I was sure were my brother's. I was staring at it where its face should have been, and he wasn't speaking. After a few moments of silence, I asked, "Bubba, what are you doing?" He didn't say a word. "Close my door." Again, nothing. I closed and rubbed my eyes, and when I looked up, he was gone, and my door was left open. I was sure that he did it to mess with me, and I was frustrated, so I got up to confront him. I wriggled out of my nest of blankets, and I went out into the living room where my parents were. But my brother was nowhere in the room, so I asked where he was, and my mum told me that he had gone out with some friends some time ago. I was confused and told them that he was just staring at me in my doorway. My mum told me that no, he wasn't, and he had been gone for hours. I pressed on and said that I just saw him and he was staring at me, not saying anything. She asked what he was wearing, and I told her that he had a striped shirt on. She told me that that wasn't what he was wearing when he left. I don't even think he owned a striped shirt actually in the end, but we all kind of shrugged it off like, that was weird. But it was hard for me to fall back asleep after that. I was very creeped out. My parents were very creeped out by that as well, and it was all just very confusing. I never did get an answer to who or what was staring at me, and I've wondered multiple times if I just, hallucinated or something. Either way, it was a creepy experience, and like I said, it's something that I think back on all the time. This happened a little over 10 years ago, but the memory is still very vivid. My parents, they had just rented a new house, and my sister and I were splitting the basement. I had my full-size mirror placed against the back wall at the time, so by looking in it, you could see the open doorway that led to the stairs. They were just around the corner of the doorway, so you couldn't actually see the stairs, though. But anyway, my sister also had a big wardrobe that she kept a TV on and clothes in, which wasn't lying flat against the other wall. It sort of came out on an angle which is back towards the stairs, basically. Now, I was doing my makeup one day not too long after moving in, and I looked down to grab something, and when I looked back up, there was a little boy crouched down in the corner behind my sister's wardrobe. I never got to see his face, but he was wearing a yellow shirt with red shorts and black shoes. As soon as I caught sight of him, even though he didn't see me see him, he got up and shot straight out the doorway, and I assume up the stairs. Of course, I got up as quick as I could and tried to chase after him, but he was gone. Also, there was no sound from him at all, no footsteps that should have been there by the way that he was sprinting, and really, there was nowhere that he could have hidden. The underneath of the stairs was open since we had just moved in. I could see every inch of it, so really there was nowhere to go. I don't know who that boy was. I tried to research the house to see if there were any stories about it, or a little boy in the area or whatever, but I couldn't find anything. All I know is that after I looked for him, I felt nothing but sadness following him. The whole area that I grew up in was known for shootings and illegal activities and such, so who knows, maybe he was a victim of something like that. I don't know, but it's just an experience that has always stuck with me ever since then, and I don't think that I'll ever forget it. This is sort of a collection of childhood encounters I and even some of my family members have had in this one haunted house over some years. One of them in particular I've told before, but I hope you guys enjoy it. So this was around 2008 to 2009-ish. I lived in a haunted house at an early age, though despite this, my memory remains fresh of most of these encounters. We were there for a year, so I was 4, turning 5 at the time. I lived with my older brother, older than me by 3 years, a younger sister, younger by 3 years, so still just a baby at the time, mother and father. The house always looked overgrown. Thin vines grew on the walls, large bushes in the front of the windows, and it was fenced in front with a large gate circling the backyard. And the hauntings, well, they started pretty quickly. My mother would hear heavy foot stomps up the stairs, despite nobody being there. She'd also hear my grandmother singing to my sister, despite my grandmother dying just months earlier. Whilst on the topic of my grandmother, my mother, she saw a massive pile of ladybugs covering the car just days after my grandmother passed. My grandmother, despite being tough, always liked ladybugs. Anyway, there was also this time that she was in the backyard. It was during the afternoon and the weather was perfect for the summer. She was closing the large gate, and mind you, she's a big and very strong lady, and yet this gate had her in one heck of a struggle. She finally closed it and locked it as she went to go inside, until she heard a sharp splintering sort of snap. She turned around to see the gate, wide open, lock busted, as if a bull had just rammed into it. My father would also get locked out of the house a lot, despite nobody being inside. And my brother, well, he would see the doors opening by themselves, and he even told me just recently about how he'd always see a girl on the other side of the gate watching him play, every day. But my experience was one of the worst. You see, I, being a mother's boy, was looking out of my window watching my mother go to work. She had a double shift, as my dad wasn't the best of dads, to put it lightly. I stared until I noticed a large pitch-black snake following her to her car. The snake looked to be double her in length, despite its slithering, thus curling its body. My mother is 5'9", which makes the snake around 11 feet long, I would guess. It had followed her for a couple of minutes, until she had gotten into her car, then it slithered back into the bushes near my window. I looked down to see it looking right at me, and despite this, I still would go outside and play like always, being a kid, I guess. Playing in the backyard till dusk, my brother and I were doing our own things on opposite sides. My brother loved sports, so he ran around throwing a football, whereas I played with one of my toy animals. The one toy in specific was a big T-Rex. The T-Rex looked like one of the older renditions before Jurassic Park, upright, with its tail dragging on the ground. As the sun set further, our mother called us inside for dinner, so we went inside, and I noticed that I left my toy, and so I went to go and get it. It was dark to where I couldn't really make out any noticeable colors, but not so dark that I couldn't see outlines and details of objects yet. And I noticed the T-Rex chilling right by the tree where I had left it. I went to pick it up, only for it to crumble as if it was dirt, in the shape of a T-Rex. I got freaked out by that, and I just ran back inside. Now, notice that I said that I can remember most of these encounters. The reason I point this out is because my father said that he'd often see me sitting in the corner of my room or in front of a blank screen. He'd ask me what I was doing, and I would always simply say that the old man told me to. I have no recollection of this happening, but my father swears up and down that this happened. He would also have these sleep paralysis episodes, I think, often seeing shadow folk around the room, whispering to each other. And this last one was definitely the most horrific. Waking up in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps. Luckily my TV was on, so I still had light. Thinking, though, that it was my dad, I got up to go and see him. But when I opened the bedroom door, there was this old man standing there. He looked down at me, and that's when I noticed that he looked corpse-like. I absolutely freaked and banged on my mother's bedroom door. She opened it, and I hollered about how there was this ugly man in the house. She took it as someone actually breaking in and picked me up with one hand and had a bat in the other and basically ran around the house, turning every light on and cussing loud enough to worry some of the neighbors. Just recently, when I was talking to my mum about the house, she said that the old man incident had actually happened twice, and that my great-grandpa might have actually known the guy. I may ask him about it sometime, but this was just one of my many paranormal experiences in that house. This happened to me and my still current boyfriend about 2 years ago. We live in a city that has a main downtown area, The main city is pretty liberal, I guess, but once you get out into the country, it can become quite the opposite. That being said, the main city, and especially the downtown area, has a pretty bad homeless problem that's only gotten worse over the years too. For the most part, the homeless population is pretty harmless. They know the good spots to hang out. A lot of the times they just smile at you, and I always smile back, and you just go on your way. Sadly, there has been an increase of incidents, infer what you will, in the last few years with the rise of overdoses and more addictive street drugs. So, I was living in the main downtown area at this time, having just recently graduated college, and wanting to be close to the nightlife. My best friend that I met in college and I were roommates, and we had an apartment right in the middle of downtown. It was pretty much the perfect setup. My boyfriend, his name was Jack, happened to live one block down and then about 5 or 6 blocks south of that. It was about a 10-minute walk, give or take. It was even closer to the heart of downtown as well. So you can probably imagine how convenient that made it for hanging out, and also not having to take a car and worry about parking and all that. Now, one overcast Sunday morning, my boyfriend and I woke up at my place and decided to walk over to his so he could grab some things. We had walked the majority of the way. It really was just a straight walk on sidewalks the whole time. We were on the right side of the road with the street to our left. We're not even 1 minute away from my boyfriend's place when I notice something ahead that makes me feel a bit uneasy. First off, there's a guy walking in front of us in the same direction that we are, with his back to us. I can see that he has both earbuds in. He's walking at about the same pace, so we aren't about to run into him or anything. In front of him, facing and walking towards all of us, is a different guy though. He had a small frame, was maybe 5'8", wearing dark pants, a red sweatshirt with the hood up, and a backpack. Even though his hood was up, I could still see his face. Some short black hair poked out, pale skin, and these black, beady, crazy eyes that I'll never forget. I assumed him to be homeless, as it was an area that was popular for them. Now, he wasn't looking at us, but rather the pedestrian with the earbuds in who happened to be closer to him and in front of us. All of a sudden, though, I see the homeless guy run and quite literally rush the pedestrian in front of us, like ran up and then stopped about a half foot from this poor dude's face. Since the guy had his headphones in, he probably just wanted to mind his own business and walk home quietly. He was clearly taken by surprise and stopped and took one of his earbuds out to see what this crazy dude wanted. Me, while I am a bit of a risk taker, I still don't like putting myself in the wrong place when I don't need to be. And this freaked me out, and I didn't want the guy to notice us and come at us next. So I stepped left off the sidewalk and into the street. Now, there was a pretty big lane for a street parking, and it was lined with parked cars, so I conveniently hid myself from view behind a car as I continued walking. I then heard this guy start yelling obscenities at this poor pedestrian. Things like, "I'm going to run you over with my car, I'm going to find you." Like I said, we were not 100 feet from the entrance to my boyfriend's apartment at this point, and after witnessing that, I just wanted to be inside. My boyfriend, he had continued walking on the sidewalk, and in an instant I had come back into view, and we turned right towards the apartment at this point. Now, the apartment did have a main entrance from the street side on the sidewalk, but my boyfriend had just moved in and didn't have the code for the front door yet. All he had was his fob to the parking garage that led to the stairwell up into the place. We were using that at the time to get in. We walked up to the parking garage door, clicked the button so that we would start rolling up. I hadn't looked behind me at that point. I knew I probably should have, but a lot of times if you just ignore the crazy person, for lack of better words, they will just in turn not bother you. So I was kind of following that tactic at that moment. The garage door was open and we went inside. My boyfriend clicked the button to close it. We started the short walk to the door to the stairwell. The garage door was nearly closed, and I don't know what prompted me to look back, but for whatever reason I did. And what I saw still gives me chills to this day. It was the homeless guy from the street. He was squeezing under the garage door while he still could. I remember the chill that ran down my spine as I locked eyes with this guy, and I yelled at my boyfriend, "Jack, he's following us." I'm really not sure what I expected my boyfriend to do, but he pushed the door to the stairwell open and started running. This was the oh no moment when I realized that this guy had access inside now, because the door to the stairwell, it didn't require a fob or have a lock. Me, definitely not wanting to be the closest one to this guy, took off running after my boyfriend. As I pushed the door open and got inside the stairwell, I could hear the guy behind me doing the same thing as it was swinging back closed. I looked back and locked eyes with this crazy guy once again, and just about wet myself as I realized that my only option was to keep running and try to get inside of our apartment and close the door before he got there. Yes, this guy was smaller, but what really freaked me out is since he had a backpack, I had no idea if he had a knife or a gun in there or what. I mean, why else would you chase two people and outnumber yourself like that, right? My boyfriend lived on the 3rd floor, of course, so we proceeded to sprint up 3 flights of stairs. I could hear this guy's pounding footsteps behind me. At last, we got to our level and opened to the door to the hallways, and sprinted to his unit, and without looking back, unlocked that door as fast as we could. It still felt incredibly slow though, and slammed the door shut right behind us. I remember taking a breath and looking through the peephole, and expecting to see this guy standing there ready to yell at us, but nothing. My heart at this point was absolutely pounding, and I mean, what the heck just happened, right? We called the cops and told them what happened to us. I'll admit that they probably did all they could, but it didn't feel like enough in the end. I mean, I was freaked out. This dude now had access to and was inside the building with access to all the apartments and residents. I just imagined him hiding in the stairwell for the next poor soul. And well, the cops came, drove around the perimeter of the complex for a few minutes. They weren't able to search inside the building because apparently they didn't have access in, and we weren't allowed to let them in for whatever reason. And they left after not finding anyone. It took me forever to get the urge to finally leave that apartment to go run our Sunday errands, but eventually we did. Now, I'm sure the guy was just high on drugs and he just decided to be crazy that morning and bother some unlucky people. He probably left after he realized that he was screwed if people found him there and somebody else would call the cops. But still, being chased up those stairs by an absolute maniac, that one I would not recommend to anyone else. This is a bit of a short one, but when I was about 6 or 7, I came home from school one day, and I hollered up the stairs to let my sister in high school know that I made it home. I hollered up a couple of times, and at no reply, decided, okay, whatever, and started to walk away. As I'm going back to my room, I then hear my sister yell out my name and tell me to come upstairs. I see an outline of my sister at the top of the stairs, and as I start walking up, it retreats back to my sister's room. As my foot hits the second stair, my sister in question walks in through the front door. I sort of freeze, looking at her with pure confusion and shock. I insist that she just called me upstairs, and she quickly yanks me into our parents' room, calling 911, knowing that no one else should be home. The police come and they conduct a full sweep of the house to discover no one. I don't know what that was, but it still creeps me out a tad to this day. Throughout my life, I believe that I've come into contact with 3 different types of paranormal spirits that have affected me in one way or another in very different types of situations. The first situation, it occurred when I was 6. My family moved into a new town in a very old house. The house that we moved into had a bit of a history we learned about later. Apparently, an adolescent who lived in the house tried to end their own life at least 3 times, twice in the house and once in a big cedar tree out front. We didn't find out about that until we'd already been living in the house over a year, and really there was nothing that we could do about it anyway. We didn't have the means to move, and it wasn't like it really should affect us in any way. But for the first few months though, living in the house, I would often wake and find pieces to a small china tea set on my headboard. I recall one in particular very vividly. It was heart-shaped, gold-trimmed, a saucer with a lady in a yellow dress waltzing with some dude. In total, I got about 8 pieces. My sister got about 5. My mum and dad had no clue where they were coming from, and we didn't own them, that's for sure. We also had a very protective Saint Bernard in the house, so no one ever really came in. While my sister and I were getting presents, my mum woke up one night hearing our Saint Bernard growling in my brother's room. When she went in there to check, a sharp shard of glass was laying on his pillow next to his head. Our Saint Bernard would always sleep in my brother's room after that too, which was really odd. The second entity that I've come into contact with, we'll fast forward about maybe 1.5 years. Now, my mum is friends with this lady called Mrs. Bradstream. My older brother is in class with one of Mrs. Bradstream's kids. It's summertime, they're moving away, so my mum offers to help them with a garage sale. There are like 8 kids total, ages from 15 down to like 4. At one point, the 15-year-old asks me if I want to go inside. It was hot out, so I did. I was 7 at this point. Somehow we ended up sitting in his closet. I don't know how, but he asked me if I wanted to, do it with him. I knew what that was at that moment, and it was only for mummy and daddies, so I just left his room. As I got downstairs, they had blankets over the windows to keep heat out, and it was in the living room when I saw it. There was a tall figure leaning on the back of the sofa. Its face was sort of burnt umber in color, and very long and angular, dark, sunken, recessed eyes. It held out a hand towards me, but upon seeing it, I took off running outside and would not leave my mum's side after that. Fast forward again, I'm 19 at university in Alaska. A bit of backstory here, as I think it's pretty relevant. My friend and I were in the same course and coming home late at night, probably around 10 p.m. At the school, you would walk 1.5 miles on the path in the woods to get from campus to housing, with a highway halfway through it. It was very snowy that evening. I was wearing boots, so I was clearing a path through the snow that had been falling. As we got up to the intersection, there was another student who was standing up there, wearing boat shoes and jeans, so I told him to just follow us, and I was nice and polite, told him that I would break a path for him. But then he started sort of stalking me. I won't include the details of the stalking, as it's a bit of a long story, but he ended up getting kicked out of school, but right before he got kicked out of school is when the event happened. Now, I was walking back from campus, by myself in the middle of the day. I was on the path and at the top of a hill, when all of a sudden, standing in the woods in front of me was this tall figure. Whatever it was wearing dark clothing, and it was that figure with the burnt umber face again. It held its hand out to me again, and I remember just feeling a horrible tug from inside myself pulling me towards it. I just stood there staring at it, and it almost felt like it was pulling me towards it, like tugging me. And eventually I'm just like, no way, and I turned and found the strength to run away. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that if I had let that thing pull me into the woods, that my stalker probably would have killed me. I'm sure that that being was showing up at times in my life where I've had to make a decision to either go this way or that way sort of thing, either death or assault or get away myself, and so far I've gotten away. It terrifies me just thinking about it, knowing that 100% positive it was the same figure that I had seen when I was 7 and when I was 19. Now, the next incident I came across is back in my hometown. But before I can really tell this incident too, I do feel it's pretty imperative to tell a little bit of background about my hometown. My hometown is in central Minnesota, and it's one of the sites of the uprising where homesteaders were violently killed. There's actually a memorial on the outside of town about the White family massacre, telling about the uprising and how the White family was slaughtered in their home. So, there's a very violent history around this area. Back in 2013, I was moved in with my uncle. He had been diagnosed with cancer and he had lived alone, so I moved in to help him out. My uncle and I got along really well. I loved him dearly, in fact. Then he passed away in the house. And well, it was about 3 or 4 days after he passed in the house that I started noticing things were off. There was a pillow that had been in my room on the top of my shelf that was suddenly in the living room. I moved the pillow from the living room. I put it in the cupboard behind a cabinet, like a big heavy wooden bookshelf cabinet that would have weighed at least 50 to 75 pounds, so it wasn't easy to move by any means. But the next day, that same pillow was in the kitchen. I put the pillow in the garage at that point, but it was back in the house. The next day I put the pillow in the shed, and it was back in the house again. I don't know what was going on with that pillow, but it wanted to be in the house for whatever reason. I ended up pulling the stuffing out of the pillow. I burnt the pillowcase, and I used the stuffing and made one little stuffed animal that I still have. It sits on my bookshelf, and it's been there ever since about 8 years now. The other ones I made with other pillows, and I gave them away, and nobody had any issues. Now recently, a neighbor of mine passed away in their house, and his nephew was living in the house with him when everything happened. The nephew stopped me outside and asked me if I knew of any paranormal things that have happened around this area. I was like, yeah, and I told him that I had had that experience with the pillow. He told me that the day after his uncle had passed, when he took a shower, he saw a small, childlike figure walk past the shower. Apparently nobody was in the house, but this figure walked by and just left finger marks across the steam on the shower wall. I was outside a couple of days after he told me about that, and I saw a light go on inside the neighbor's house. I checked the vehicles outside, and nobody was home. The lights were on, and about 3 minutes, then the lights went out, and they did this for about an hour, flashing on and off every 3 minutes. So I asked my neighbor if he had any smart lights or anything that would go on and off, and kind of a flicker when they don't have a good connection or whatever. But he said no, they never got any of those. So I mentioned the light going on and off, and he confirmed that no one was home that day. I guess after that happened as well, he was too afraid to do anything about it, so eventually he just left the house and went out and slept in the fish house. Now, this may seem a little bit far-fetched, but this is just my conclusion. I'm pretty sure that this town is actually haunted by the spirits of the warriors and victims from the area who were a part of the massacre some time ago, and when death occurs or something bad, they seem to come around and try to make us uncomfortable for whatever reason. Obviously, that's just a guess, but it's the best theory that I can come up with so far. So, if you have any thoughts, then I'm certainly all ears. So, there's been 2 happenings in the past week or 2. The first time I went outside to call our cat in, and then 2 of my brothers locked the door as a joke, so I started pretending to be our cat, meowing and scratching at the door. We were all laughing. I could hear them laughing through the door as well. But then I heard a meow. We had let the cat in. She ran in when my brothers closed the door. It was from the edge of the darkness, and I knew that it wasn't my cat. It was someone or something mimicking a meow. 3 of our neighbours moved out recently, so 3 houses were empty and have been for months, and our other neighbours were out or either asleep and no one was walking past. Eventually I went inside and I just sort of forgot about it. The second time though, my mum had gone out, so we were watching the house at this point. I was playing games with my brother and I heard a knock at the door, so I yelled to my younger siblings to open the door and let Mum in. The kids wouldn't respond, so I went to do it, and the wooden door was open, and the screen door was closed but unlocked. Now, none of the kids had seen Mum at the door. It happened about 5 minutes later, except there's a voice that said yoo-hoo at me at the same time, through the window, so I check it. I was already next to it. But the weirdest thing is that nobody was there. And I mean, I heard it clear as day, and there was really nowhere to hide. I was looking through the window in less than a second as well. Plus, my mum actually came home 5 or 10 minutes later as well. I have no idea what that was or how it happened, but something makes me think that it was related to the meowing I heard the other night. Also, just the other day, I heard something tapping on my window. I heard it like a slow tap to get my attention, or like someone gently throwing a small rock at your window to get you to look out. I refused to look out, not even a chance I was going to. But I have to admit that this whole thing is starting to scare me, and that's why I'm here. What should I do about this? So, this happened to me when I was 6 or 7, living in Massachusetts. Back then, my family and I lived in a basement under this family and their 2 kids. Like I said, I was around 6 or 7 at this time, and this family had a daughter that was probably 4 or 5, and another that was maybe 10. Now, the 5-year-old was a strange little girl from the very moment you met her. Her name was Amy. Amy was quiet and wide-eyed, and would just kind of stare through you every time you talked to her even, and she would just not like to have company from anyone, not even her mother. And one day, my mum came to me asking me to play more with Amy because she was so alone and had no friends and all that. Since I didn't know anything at the time, I was just like, whatever, and I went upstairs to play with her. Once I got there, I was just kind of hanging out with her in the living room, watching cartoons while she just sat there. Her sister then comes into the room and asks me if I really came to play with Amy. I said that yes, I did, but she really didn't give me attention, so I was just going to kind of watch TV. Her sister then turns to me and says something like, "Good, don't interact with her too much, she's not right." I didn't really think too much of it at that time, and the day kind of ended with nothing more happening. In fact, it was pretty boring, really. A couple of days later, I go out to play with Amy again. My mum told me to. And after a few minutes there, Amy turns to me and says, "You need to leave. She doesn't like it when I play with you," while constantly shifting her eyes from me to the windows. I don't remember exactly what happened because it was years ago, but I remember feeling super queasy at the time and very uncomfortable, so I just sort of went back home and told my mum what happened. Now, my mum was a very Christian woman, and so was Amy's mum. When I told her this, she immediately got very worried and told me not to go back there. Apparently, Amy's mum had already told my mum that Amy always mentioned a friend that would tell her what to do and what to say, like an imaginary friend. I didn't really have much more contact with Amy alone after this, but I did learn what comes next as an adult talking to my mum about it. After Amy said that I couldn't play with her anymore, my mum and her mum went to talk to Amy to understand what was wrong and why she didn't want to play with me. That's when Amy first described her friend in detail. Apparently, she said that her friend would yell at her and make her do bad things if she didn't obey her. She described her friend as a young girl, just a bit older than her, with dirt on her face and under her nails, and wearing a dirty old white dress. Her friend also had very bad teeth, according to Amy. As she was telling me this, my mum says that Amy started crying and screaming while staring at the window. "Get out of here. I'm not going to follow you. Mum, make her stop. She wants me to follow her out of the window. Please get her out of here. I don't like her. She's getting angry." Our mothers immediately took her out of the house and we all went to stay at the church. Amy said the girl would come crawling on the ceiling apparently, and up the walls at night to her room, and tell her to do bad things like swear at her sister, beat her parents, not brush her teeth. She didn't and had cavities all over her teeth, and even things like grab a knife or jump out her window. A few days later, they all went into Amy's room. My mum, her mum, Amy, and a pastor from our church to try and to do, I don't know, exercise whatever was there or whatever. My mum says at first Amy was crying while this happened and begging them to stop. But then she started laughing and saying that they were weak and sinners and things like that. Eventually, apparently Amy just kind of passed out sleeping. I'm really not sure what happened next because we moved out of the house and after that I never saw Amy again. What I do know though is that my mum says the pastors went to her house several more times and Amy also went to a psychologist and a psychiatrist as well. I didn't see most of this happening other than her telling me not to play with her and the super weird vibes from being near her. I remember very vividly that whenever she got into the room, you could sort of feel the mood change and get heavier, even to a 7-year-old. Anyways, that's my story. I have no pictures or anything like that, but I still get goosebumps just thinking about Amy. She was a very, very creepy little girl. Sorry if you want more than this, but I really don't know all the details because I was so young back then, and most of what I know today is just from asking my parents, so yeah. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I also hope that Amy's doing okay.